I'll never forget the day my mother erased me. Not with words of anger, not with a moment of rage, but with a cold, calculated board meeting where she removed my name from the family business I'd bled for while my incompetent brother got everything. "You don't deserve to be part of this family," she said as security escorted me out. I walked away in silence, broken, invisible, nothing. But what my mother didn't know was that my father had seen her coming. Years before his death, he'd hidden something a secret, so powerful it would change everything. And he'd left it for me. 10 years later, I built an empire from nothing. And when her company finally collapsed under her arrogance, she came to my office, hands trembling, pride shattered, with 5 words I'd waited a decade to hear: "I need your signature." She thought she'd destroyed me, but the forgotten daughter was about to become the only one who could save them all. This is the story of how I took back everything she stole. And it started with one signature. My name is Jessica Parker, and at 32 years old, I was the invisible backbone of Parker Home Supplies, the family business my father built from nothing. For the past decade, I'd poured everything into this company, working 60-hour weeks, managing operations, negotiating contracts, and solving problems no one else wanted to touch. But in my mother's eyes, I might as well have been another piece of office furniture. Monday morning arrived like every other, with me at my desk by 6:30, reviewing quarterly projections while the building sat empty and silent. I'd identified 3 supply chain inefficiencies that could save us nearly $200,000 annually, and I'd compiled everything into a detailed report for the board meeting scheduled for next week. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I barely noticed. This was my routine: arrive early, leave late, and hope that maybe this time someone would actually see the work I was doing. By 9 o'clock, the office hummed with activity, and my brother Andrew strolled past my door without a glance. Andrew Parker, Vice President of Innovation. A title that sounded impressive until you realised he'd launched 3 failed product lines in 2 years. Each disaster had cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars, yet somehow he remained untouchable. Our mother, Margaret Parker, CO, and majority owner, forgave every mistake with a wave of her hand and words I'd heard countless times. "He's learning, he has vision, give him time." I'd stopped expecting the same grace years ago. That evening we gathered for the quarterly company dinner at the Madison Club, one of those restaurants where everything is mahogany and hushed conversations. I sat at the far end of the long table, watching my mother hold court, at the head, her silver hair perfectly styled, her smile warm and practiced. Andrew sat to her right, of course, basking in her attention like he always did. I want to commend Andrew for his bold vision with the Smart Home Initiative, Margaret announced, raising her wine glass. The entire table turned toward my brother, who nodded modestly as if he deserved the praise. I felt my jaw tighten. The Smart Home Initiative had been a spectacular failure over budget, poorly executed, and ultimately discontinued after only 6 months. I'd sent 3 separate memos warning the strategy was flawed, but no one had listened. "Jessica," my mother's voice cut through my thoughts, and I realised she was looking at me. "I reviewed your quarterly report. The supply chain recommendations are adequate. Just keep doing your job." Just doing your job. The words landed like a slap. $200,000 in savings was adequate. 10 years of 60-hour weeks was just doing my job. Around the table, people shifted uncomfortably, but no one said anything. They never did. Andrew caught my eye across the table, and for just a moment I saw something that might have been guilt flicker across his face. Then he looked away, and the moment passed. I left the dinner early, making some excuse about preparing for an early meeting. No one tried to stop me. Instead, I drove to Riverside Cemetery, parking under the old oak tree near my father's grave. Robert Parker, devoted husband-loving, father, visionary entrepreneur. The words on the headstone felt like a cruel joke now. He died of a heart attack 2 years ago during what everyone called a particularly stressful period at the company. I knew the truth was more complicated than that, but Margaret had controlled the narrative as she controlled everything else. I sat on the stone bench facing his grave, the evening air cool against my skin. "I'm trying, Dad," I whispered. "I'm still trying to make you proud." This was the only place I felt seen anymore, talking to a man who couldn't answer back. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the screen illuminating in the gathering darkness. A text from Margaret, formal and cold as always. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. Attendance mandatory." I stared at those words, something cold settling in my stomach. Margaret never called emergency meetings. In 10 years, I'd never seen her deviate from the scheduled quarterly reviews. Whatever was coming tomorrow, I knew with absolute certainty that my world was about to change forever. I barely slept that night. The text from Margaret played on repeat in my mind, each reading, filling me with a dread I couldn't quite name. By the time my alarm went off at 5:30, I'd already been awake for 2 hours, staring at the ceiling and running through every possible scenario. Maybe the emergency meeting was about a major client. Maybe one of Andrew's disasters had finally caught up with him. Maybe, just maybe, Margaret had finally seen my value and was ready to promote me. Even as I thought it, I knew how desperate that hope sounded. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing my best navy suit and the pearl earrings my father had given me for my 30th birthday. I wanted to look professional, composed, ready for whatever was coming. In the mirror, I looked like someone who belonged in that boardroom. I wish I'd known then that appearances wouldn't matter at all. I arrived at Parker Home Supplies at 8:40, 20 minutes early as always. The parking lot was already full, which struck me as odd for a Tuesday morning. Through the glass doors, I could see people moving purposefully through the lobby, but something felt wrong. The energy was different, charged with a tension I couldn't identify. Sarah from accounting caught my eye as I walked toward the elevators, and instead of her usual warm smile, she looked away quickly, her face flushing red. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt longer than usual. My reflection stared back at me from the polished steel doors, and I noticed my hands were trembling slightly. I clasped them together, took a deep breath, and told myself I was being paranoid. This was just another meeting. I'd sat through hundreds of them. The boardroom door was closed when I arrived at precisely 9 o'clock. I reached for the handle, but it opened before I could touch it, and Margaret's assistant Linda appeared, her expression carefully neutral. "They're ready for you, Jessica," she said quietly, and something in her tone made my stomach drop. I stepped inside, and the scene before me made my blood run cold. This wasn't a normal board meeting. Margaret sat at the head of the table in her usual position, but flanked by Richard Morrison, the company's lawyer, whose presence at routine meetings was unusual. All 6 board members were present, their faces grave and uncomfortable. Andrew sat to Margaret's right, staring down at the polished table, as if it held the secrets of the universe. And there, arranged in neat stacks at each seat, were bound documents that clearly hadn't been there for any meeting I'd attended before. "Jessica, please sit," Margaret said, gesturing to the single chair that had been placed at the opposite end of the table, as far from her as possible. It felt deliberately isolating, like I was facing a tribunal rather than joining colleagues. I sat slowly, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong, but I kept my face composed, my spine straight. "What's this about?" I asked, pleased that my voice came out steady. Margaret didn't answer directly. Instead, she nodded to Richard, who cleared his throat and began speaking in that careful legal tone that lawyers use when they're delivering bad news. "Jessica, the board has been conducting a comprehensive review of Parker Home Supply's organisational structure. After careful consideration, we've determined that a significant restructuring is necessary to position the company for future growth and innovation." I felt the words like physical blows, even though I didn't yet understand their full meaning. "Restructuring," I repeated. "What kind of restructuring?" "Effective immediately. Your position as Director of Operations is being eliminated." Richard continued, sliding one of the bound documents toward me. "Additionally, your equity stake in the company, which currently stands at 8%, is being reabsorbed by the primary shareholders in exchange for a severance package outlined in these documents." The room tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what I was hearing. Eliminated, reabsorbed, severance. These were words used when firing someone, when removing them entirely. "I don't understand," I said, looking past Richard to Margaret. "You're firing me from the family business after 10 years. Margaret's face remained impassive, carved from stone. "The company requires visionary leadership to compete in today's market, Jessica. We need innovation, bold thinking, strategic risk-taking. What we don't need is operational management that resists change and questions every decision." The accusation was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality, that I actually laughed. It came out harsh and bitter. "Resists change, I've implemented every efficiency improvement this company has seen in the last 5 years. I've saved us millions in operational costs. I've negotiated contracts that Andrew couldn't even understand, let alone execute. This isn't a discussion." Margaret cut me off, her voice sharp as a blade. "The decision has been made. The board has voted unanimously." She paused, and for the first time I looked around at the 6 board members. Not one would meet my eyes. They'd already decided. This meeting wasn't about deliberation or input. It was about delivering a verdict that had been determined long before I walked through that door. "Andrew will assume the role of executive vice president and heir apparent," Margaret continued, and I watched my brother's shoulders tighten at the words. "He has the vision this company needs to move forward. He understands that success requires boldness, not caution." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about restructuring or vision or any of the corporate language they were hiding behind. This was about erasing me completely, about ensuring that Andrew inherited everything while I received nothing. "You planned this," I said quietly, looking at Margaret. "This wasn't a sudden decision. You've been working on this for months." Something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been satisfaction. "Sign the documents, Jessica. The severance package is generous. You'll have 4 weeks to clear out your office and transition your responsibilities." "And if I don't sign?" The question came out stronger than I felt. Richard spoke up again, his tone professionally apologetic. "The restructuring proceeds regardless. The only question is whether you accept the severance package or leave with nothing." I looked at Andrew, then really looked at him silently, begging him to say something to stand up for me the way I'd covered for his mistakes 100 times. His hand gripped his pen so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and I saw his jaw working like he was trying to force words out. But he stayed silent, eyes fixed on the table, and in that silence I heard everything I needed to know. "You don't deserve to be part of this family." Margaret's words fell into the silence like stones, into water final and irrevocable. She raised her hand slightly, and I heard the boardroom door open behind me. "Security will escort you to your office. You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings." I stood slowly, leaving the unsigned documents on the table. 2 security guards I'd known for years stood in the doorway, their faces professionally blank, and I walked past them with my head high because I refused to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing me break. Not here, not in front of her. As I reached the door, I glanced back one final time. Andrew's hand was still gripping that pen, shaking now, but his eyes remained down. And I knew that whatever happened next, I was completely alone. The hour I spent packing my office passed in a blur of humiliation. Security guards stood outside my door while I filled cardboard boxes with 10 years of my life, framed certifications, the desk organizer. My father had given me a coffee mug that said "World's Best Operations Manager," that now felt like a cruel joke. Colleagues walked past without making eye contact, their whispers following me down the hallway like ghosts. By 10:30 that morning, I was walking out of Parker Home Supplies for the last time, carrying 2 boxes and whatever remained of my dignity. I refused to sign their severance papers. It felt like signing away the truth, admitting I deserved this erasure. So I left with nothing but my personal belongings and the sick certainty that Margaret had won completely. The apartment I moved into 3 days later was a small 1-bedroom in a complex 20 minutes from my old house. I'd given up the townhouse I'd been renting, too expensive, now too full of memories of the person I thought I was. This new place had beige carpet and white walls and a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. The landlord had looked at my bank statements and employment history with barely concealed skepticism before finally, reluctantly approving my application. I could see the question in his eyes. Why was someone with my credentials suddenly unemployed and desperate for a cheap rental? The moving truck delivered my furniture on a Tuesday afternoon, and then I was alone with boxes I couldn't bring myself to unpack. They sat in towers around the living room, each one a reminder of a life that no longer existed. I'd open one, pull out a few items, and then stop paralysed by the weight of what I'd lost. Who was I without Parker Home Supplies, without the 60-hour weeks and the quarterly reports and the constant striving to be seen? I'd built my entire identity around that company, and now I was nothing but an empty apartment and unopened boxes. The worst part was the silence. I'd lived alone for years, but I'd never felt lonely because work had filled every space in my life. Now, with nothing but time stretching endlessly before me, I realised with crushing clarity that I had no one to call, no friends to meet for coffee or lunch, no social life beyond company dinners I'd always left early. Every relationship I'd built had been professional, transactional, connected to Parker Home Supplies. And now, that connection was severed. Those people had vanished from my life as completely as if they'd never existed. I tried calling a few former colleagues that first week, people I'd worked with for years, shared coffee breaks and late nights finishing projects. Every call went to voicemail. Every text went unanswered. Margaret's influence ran deep, and I understood with bitter certainty that she'd made it clear anyone who maintained contact with me would face consequences. So they'd chosen their paychecks over whatever friendship we'd shared, and I couldn't even blame them for it. By the end of the first week, my savings account balance glowed accusingly on my laptop screen. 3 months of expenses, maybe 4 if I was careful. I'd always been responsible with money, but I'd never imagined I'd need an emergency fund for being erased from my own family's company. I opened job search websites and stared at listings that all seemed to require the one thing: I couldn't provide references from my previous employer. My entire resume was Parker Home Supplies. 10 years of one company, one long line of achievements that now looked like a liability. Who would hire someone publicly fired from their family business? What story could I possibly tell in interviews that wouldn't raise immediate red flags? I imagined sitting across from hiring managers, watching their faces change as they Googled my name and found whatever version of events Margaret had undoubtedly crafted. The incompetent daughter, the bitter family member, the employee who wasn't good enough. I applied to dozens of positions anyway, crafting careful cover letters that tried to explain my situation without sounding desperate or damaged. Most applications disappeared into the void without even an automated rejection. The few that responded asked for references, and when I couldn't provide them, the conversations ended quickly. By day 7, I'd stopped showering regularly. I wore the same sweatpants for 3 days straight. I ate cereal for dinner standing over the sink because sitting at a table alone felt too depressing to bear. The boxes remained unpacked monuments to a life I couldn't figure out how to rebuild. I slept 12 hours a day and still woke up exhausted, drained by the constant loop of thoughts that told me I was worthless, that Margaret had been right all along, that I'd never been good enough, and now everyone could see it. On the 8th night, I sat on my couch at 11 o'clock, scrolling through job listings I was no longer even reading, just moving my finger across the screen in mechanical repetition, because it gave me something to do besides think. The apartment was dark except for my laptop's glow. I hadn't turned on lights in hours. Outside my window, I could hear traffic from the main road, people going places, living lives, having purpose. I had none of those things anymore. My phone rang and I almost didn't answer it. Unknown number, late night call, probably a spam caller, or wrong number. But something made me swipe to accept, and a man's voice came through. steady and warm and somehow familiar even though I couldn't place it. "Jessica, this is Martin Chen. Your father asked me to call you if this day ever came." I sat up straighter, my heart suddenly pounding. Martin Chen. I knew that name. My father had mentioned him occasionally. An old friend from his early days building the company, someone who'd left Parker Home Supplies long before I started working there. But I'd never met him, never spoken to him, certainly never expected him to call me out of nowhere in the middle of the night. "How did you get my number?" I asked, my voice hoarse from disuse. "I've been keeping track of you for years, Jessica. Your father made me promise." There was a pause, and I could hear traffic noise on his end too, like he was calling from a car. "I was your father's closest friend, and I know what Margaret did. Not just now, what she's been doing for years. We need to meet. Tonight." "Tonight, it's 11 o'clock. I don't even know who you are." "I'm the person your father trusted to protect you when he couldn't anymore." Martin's voice carried absolute certainty, no hesitation or doubt. "I'm at the Silver Moon Diner on Route 22. I'll wait as long as it takes. But Jessica, you need to hear what I have to tell you. Your father prepared for this moment. He knew Margaret would come for you eventually, and he made sure you wouldn't face it alone." I sat in the darkness of my apartment for a full minute after Martin hung up his words, echoing in my mind. Your father prepared for this moment. The idea that my father had anticipated Margaret's betrayal, that he'd put protections in place before he died, seemed impossible. Yet something in Martin's voice had carried the weight of truth, and after 8 days of crushing isolation, the possibility of answers pulled at me like gravity. I grabbed my keys and drove to the Silver Moon Diner without even changing out of my sweatpants. At this point, I had nothing left to lose, certainly not my dignity. The diner sat on a lonely stretch of Route 22, its neon sign flickering against the night sky. Through the windows, I could see scattered customers at the counter and booths, and in the back corner, a man in his early 60s with silver hair sat alone watching the door, like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. Martin Chen stood when I approached, and I was struck immediately by how much he looked like someone my father would have trusted. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a sort of steady, intelligent gaze that missed nothing. He wore a simple, button-down shirt and slacks, professional even at this late hour, and when he extended his hand, his grip was firm and warm. "Jessica," he said simply. "Thank you for coming. I know this must seem strange." "Strange doesn't begin to cover it," I said, sliding into the booth across from him. A waitress appeared immediately with coffee, and I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, suddenly aware of how cold I'd been for days. "You said my father asked you to call me, but he died 2 years ago. Why now? Why wait until after Margaret destroyed me?" Martin's expression grew grave. "Because your father made me promise to wait until she made her move. He said, Margaret will come for Jessica eventually. She can't help herself. When she does, that's when Jessica will be ready to hear the truth. But I guess he knew you needed to see what she really was before you'd believe what I had to tell you." The words hit me like a physical blow. My father had known. He'd known Margaret would betray me, and he'd done nothing to stop it. If he knew, why didn't he protect me? Why let her do this? "Because protection isn't the same as preparation," Martin said quietly. "Your father understood that you needed to break free from Margaret's control, even if that breaking was painful. As long as you were at Parker Home Supplies, you'd always be under her thumb, always trying to earn approval she would never give. He wanted you to be free, Jessica. And freedom requires leaving, even when leaving hurts." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but refused to let them fall. "You said you knew what Margaret did. What does that mean? What did she do besides erase me from the family business?" Martin took a long breath, his hands folding on the table. 15 years ago, I was CFO of Parker Home Supplies. Your father and I built that company together from nothing. We were partners in every sense that mattered, even if the Parker name was on the door. His voice carried the weight of old wounds. I discovered financial irregularities in our accounts. Money being redirected, signatures that didn't quite match documents that had been altered. It took me 3 months to trace everything back to Margaret. My stomach clenched. She was stealing from the company. Not stealing exactly, redirecting funds to accounts she controlled, forging your father's signature on documents to give herself more power, more control. She'd been doing it for years, slowly positioning herself to take over everything. Martin's jaw tightened. When I confronted her with the evidence, she told me I was mistaken. Then she went to your father and told him I was the one embezzling, that I was trying to destroy the company from within. She had fabricated documents, fake evidence, everything she needed to make her lie convincing. And my father believed her. The question came out bitter, disbelieving. Your father was torn. He loved Margaret Tuajama, wanted to believe the best of her, and she was very convincing. Martin's eyes met mine and I saw old pain there. She forced me out, made me sign a non-disclosure agreement, threatened legal action if I ever spoke about what I'd found. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back and the knowledge that I'd failed to protect your father from his own wife. The diner seemed too bright, suddenly the conversation around us too loud. I tried to process what Martin was telling me, but it felt too big, too terrible. So you just left? You abandoned him? I didn't have a choice at the time, but your father came to me 3 days before he died. Martin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope yellowed with age. He was devastated, Jessica. He'd finally discovered the truth about what Margaret had done, not just to me, but to the company, to everything we'd built. He said the stress was killing him, that he couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight, and he was terrified of what she would do to you. My hand shook as I stared at the envelope. My name was written across it in my father's handwriting, and seeing those familiar letters made something crack inside my chest. What does it say? I don't know. He made me swear not to open it, to only give it to you when Margaret came for you. Martin slid the envelope across the table, and I picked it up with trembling fingers. He also made me promise something else. He said, when this happens, help her rebuild. Don't let Margaret destroy my daughter the way she destroyed everything else I loved. I held the envelope against my chest, feeling the weight of my father's words pressing against my heart. I don't know how to rebuild. I don't even know who I am without that company. You're exactly who your father raised you to be, Martin said firmly. Brilliant, capable, ethical, strong. Everything Margaret isn't. He pulled a business card from his wallet and set it on the table. I advise struggling startups, help them restructure and find their footing. There's a company I've been working with that needs a chief operating officer. The pay isn't glamorous, the office is cramped, and you'll be working with a team of 5 people instead of 200. But they need someone with your skills, and you need a place to prove that your worth isn't tied to the Parker name. I looked at the card, then back at Martin. Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. I knew your father. That's enough. Martin's voice softened. He taught you everything, Jessica. Every skill, every value, every piece of wisdom you carry. Now it's time to prove Margaret wrong by succeeding without her, by building something she can't touch or control or take away from you. For the first time in 8 days, I felt something other than despair. It was small, fragile, barely more than a spark. But it was hope, and I grabbed onto it with both hands. When do I start? Monday morning, if you're ready. Martin stood, leaving cash on the table for the coffee. But Jessica, there's one more thing you need to know. I stood as well, clutching the envelope and the business card like lifelines. What? Martin's expression was unreadable, somewhere between promise and warning. Your father left you something. something Margaret doesn't know about something that could change everything. But you need to earn the right to claim it first. You need to prove you're strong enough to handle what he left behind, wise enough to use it correctly. Build yourself back up. Show me you can succeed on your own merit without the Parker name propping you up. Then when you're ready, I'll tell you what he left you. I walked out of the Silver Moon Diner that night with my father's unopened letter pressed against my heart and Martin's challenge ringing in my ears. Earn the right to claim it. The words stung, but they also ignited something I hadn't felt in weeks' determination. Whatever my father had left me, I would prove I deserved it. Not because Margaret said I wasn't worthy, but because I needed to know for myself that I was more than the invisible daughter she'd erased. Monday morning arrived with the sharp clarity of a new beginning. I drove to the address Martin had given me, a converted warehouse in an industrial part of town that looked nothing like Parker Home Supply's polished corporate headquarters. The company was called Meridian Solutions, and they manufactured eco-friendly packaging materials for small businesses. The office occupied the second floor, accessible only by a creaking freight elevator that groaned ominously with every floor. The space itself was cramped and cluttered with mismatched desks crammed into what had probably once been a storage room. 5 people looked up when I entered, their faces curious but not unwelcoming. The founder, a woman named Claire Bennett, in her early 40s with paint-stained jeans and an infectious smile, bounded over to shake my hand with genuine enthusiasm. "You must be Jessica. Martin said you worked miracles with operations management. God knows we need miracles around here." She laughed, gesturing at the organised chaos surrounding us. "Welcome to the beautiful disaster that is Meridian Solutions." The salary they offered was half what I'd made at Parker Home Supplies. The benefits were minimal. My desk was a folding table wedged between filing cabinets. But when Claire asked for my thoughts on their current supply chain strategy during that first meeting, she actually listened. She took notes. She asked follow-up questions. And when I finished explaining my initial observations, she said simply, "That's brilliant. Let's implement it." No dismissal, no condescension, just respect for my expertise. I hadn't realised how starved I'd been for that basic professional courtesy until I experienced it. For the first time in my career, I wasn't fighting to be heard. I was just working, contributing, being valued for what I brought to the table, rather than constantly trying to prove I belonged there. The first 3 months passed in a blur of long hours and hard work, but it was different from the exhaustion I'd felt at Parker Home Supplies. This was productive exhaustion, the kind that came from building something rather than defending my right to exist. I threw myself into understanding every aspect of Meridian's operations, spending time on the manufacturing floor, interviewing vendors, analysing every contract and agreement with the kind of detailed attention I'd always brought to my work but had rarely seen appreciated. During a routine contract review in my 3rd month, I discovered something that made my pulse quicken with familiar excitement. Our primary raw material supplier was charging us significantly above market rate, and their delivery schedule was causing production bottlenecks that cost us thousands in overtime and rush orders. I spent 2 weeks researching alternatives, negotiating with new vendors, and developing a comprehensive proposal that would cut our supply costs by 15% and streamline our production timeline. When I presented my findings to Claire and the team, I braced myself for the usual pushback, the inevitable, "but we've always done it this way," that had met so many of my suggestions at Parker Home Supplies. Instead, Claire studied the numbers with growing excitement, then looked up at me with something like wonder in her eyes. "This saves us nearly $200,000 annually," she said, her voice almost reverent. "Jessica, where did you learn to analyse contracts like this?" The question caught me off guard. At Parker Home Supplies, my analysis had been dismissed as just doing your job, nothing special or noteworthy. Here it was treated as the valuable skill it actually was. "My father taught me," I said quietly. "He believed in understanding every detail of a business from the ground up." "Your father taught you well," Claire replied, and there was no condescension in her voice, just genuine appreciation. "Let's move forward with this immediately." Watching my strategy get implemented, seeing the real impact of my work reflected in improved efficiency and cost savings rebuilt something in me that Margaret had tried to destroy. I wasn't incompetent. I wasn't invisible. I was good at what I did, and in the right environment, with people who valued competence over family politics, I could excel. The real transformation came 6 months after I joined Meridian. Claire had been pursuing a partnership with a major retail chain that could triple our revenue, but negotiations had stalled over concerns about our production capacity and delivery reliability. She asked me to join the final negotiation meeting, and I spent a week preparing, using every skill my father had taught me about reading people, understanding leverage, and finding solutions that served everyone's interests. The meeting lasted 4 hours. I presented detailed projections showing how we could scale production to meet their needs, negotiated delivery schedules that worked for both parties, and, personally, guaranteed our quality standards based on the systems I'd implemented. When the retail chain's representative finally extended his hand and said, "We have a deal," I felt a surge of pride so powerful it almost brought me to tears. Claire promoted me to Vice President of Operations the next day. Not because of my last name, not because of family connections or political manoeuvring, but because I'd earned it through competence, hard work, and results. She announced it at our weekly team meeting, and all 5 people in that cramped office stood and applauded. It was the first promotion in my career that felt completely, undeniably mine. 2 weeks later, Claire insisted on taking me to dinner to celebrate officially. We went to a small Italian restaurant downtown, and over wine and pasta, she told me I'd transformed Meridian from a struggling startup into a company with real potential. "You've given us a future," she said. "I can't thank you enough." I was basking in that warmth, in the unfamiliar sensation of being genuinely appreciated, when Martin appeared at our table. I hadn't known he was joining us, but Claire greeted him warmly, clearly in on whatever this was. He sat down, ordered coffee, and waited until Claire excused herself to the restroom before speaking. "You've done well, Jessica," he said, his tone serious despite the celebration around us. "Better than I expected, actually. You've proven you can succeed without the Parker name, that your skills are real, and your judgment is sound." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table with careful deliberation. "It's time you knew about the Parker Family Trust." I stared at the manila folder like it might explode. The Parker Family Trust. Just hearing those words connected to my father made my chest tighten with a complicated mix of longing and dread. Martin's expression was carefully neutral as he waited for me to open it, but I could see the weight of what he was about to reveal in the tension around his eyes. "What is this?" I asked, my hand hovering over the folder without touching it. "Not here," Martin said quietly, glancing around the restaurant. "This conversation requires privacy and time. Meet me at my office tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. What I'm about to show you will change everything you think you know about your father's legacy." That night, I barely slept. The folder sat on my kitchen counter unopened while I paced my apartment trying to imagine what could be inside. My father had left me something Martin had said, something Margaret didn't know about. But what could it be? Money, property? Some kind of insurance policy? And why had Martin waited 6 months to tell me? The next morning, I arrived at Martin's office at 8:45, too anxious to be fashionably late. But Martin wasn't ready to explain yet. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I'd come to recognize over the past 6 months, the look of someone who saw potential that needed time to develop. "Not yet," he said simply. "You're doing well, Jessica. Better than well. But you need to keep building, keep proving to yourself what you're capable of. When you're ready, truly ready, we'll open this folder together." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in his tone stopped me. My father had trusted Martin with this secret. If Martin said I wasn't ready, maybe he was right. So I took the folder home, placed it in my desk drawer, and threw myself back into my work at Meridian Solutions with renewed determination. The years that followed transformed me in ways I couldn't have imagined that night at the Silver Moon Diner. I spent 2 more years at Meridian, helping Claire build the company into a regional success story. Then I was recruited by a struggling manufacturing firm that needed someone who understood operational turnarounds. I spent 18 months there rebuilding their supply chain and restoring profitability. Then another company called and another, each one a business on the edge of failure that needed the kind of detailed strategic thinking I'd spent my entire career developing. By my 35th birthday, I'd worked with 7 different companies, each one a success story, each one proof that my skills were real and valuable. That's when I made the decision to stop working for other people and start building something of my own. I founded JP Consulting, using my father's maiden name Park as a quiet tribute to the man who taught me everything while keeping enough distance from the Parker name that Margaret's shadow couldn't reach me. JP Consulting specialized in rescuing failing businesses, companies on the edge of bankruptcy, drowning in operational chaos, bleeding money from inefficiency. Those were my clients. I'd assemble small teams, dive deep into their operations, identify the problems everyone else had missed, and implement solutions that actually worked. Within 2 years, I had a reputation. Within 3, I was featured in business magazines with headlines like "The Fixer Who Turns Dying Companies into Gold" and "How One Woman Builds Success from Business Failures." Now at 37, I sat in my own corner office in a building I'd chosen, leading a team of 15 exceptional people I'd personally recruited, with a client list that would have made my younger self weep with pride. I'd rebuilt myself completely, brick by brick, success by success, until the woman Margaret had tried to erase no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and utterly independent. That's when Martin called and asked me to come to his office. 5 years after he'd first shown me that manila folder, he said it was finally time. I arrived at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and Martin Dutton was waiting with the folder open on his desk, its contents spread across the polished wood like pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to solve. He gestured for me to sit, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly, not from age, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. "Your father created the Parker Family Trust 20 years ago." Martin began without preamble. At the time, Parker Home Supplies was just beginning to grow into something significant, and your father was smart enough to know that success changes people. He wanted to make sure that, no matter what happened, no matter how Margaret might try to consolidate power, you would always have a stake in what he'd built. He slid the first document toward me, a legal trust agreement, dense with language I had to read twice to understand. He placed 40% of Parker Home Supplies into this trust structure with you as the sole beneficiary. The shares are held as non-voting preferred stock until specific conditions are met, either you turn 35 or the company faces insolvency proceedings. My heart stopped. 40%? I owned 40% of Parker Home Supplies. "I turned 35 2 years ago," I said slowly, which means you've been the second largest shareholder of Parker Home Supplies for 2 years, Martin confirmed. "Your mother holds 35%, your brother holds 25%. The remaining 5% is distributed among board members and early investors. But Jessica, you own more than any of them." I stared at the documents, my mind racing through the implications. "But these are non-voting shares. What does that mean?" "It means you receive dividends and have ownership rights, but you can't vote in board meetings or influence company decisions. Your father structured it this way deliberately. He wanted you to have a financial stake in the company's success, but he also wanted to protect you from Margaret's manipulation by keeping you out of the power struggles." Martin's expression grew complicated. "Margaret has been operating under the assumption that she owns 100% of the voting shares. She has no idea this trust exists." The bitter irony of it hit me like a physical blow. For 2 years, while I'd been building JP Consulting into a success, while I'd been proving I didn't need the Parker name I'd secretly owned nearly half of the company that had erased me, Margaret had spent over a decade believing she'd consolidated complete control, never knowing my father had outmaneuvered her from beyond the grave. "Why didn't you tell me when I turned 35? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Because your father made me promise to wait until you'd proven you could succeed independently. He didn't want you to rely on this inheritance, to see it as a crutch or a safety net. He wanted you to know absolutely and without question that your worth had nothing to do with Parker Home Supplies. Martin's eyes met mine with fierce pride. And you've proven that, Jessica. Everything you've built, you built yourself. I looked down at the trust document, seeing my father's signature at the bottom, and felt tears burning behind my eyes. Even in death, he'd been protecting me, believing in me, preparing me for a future he wouldn't live to see. There's more your father built into this trust, Martin said quietly, gathering the papers back into the folder. Additional clauses, conditions, protections. But I don't have all the details. Your father kept some things even from me. Be patient. When the time is right, everything will become clear. I left Martin's office that day with a strange sense of duality. Part of me wanted to march straight to Parker Home Supplies and announce to Margaret that I owned 40% of her precious company, that every decision she'd made for over a decade had been under the shadow of ownership she didn't even know existed. But the wiser part of me, the part my father had carefully cultivated, understood that knowledge was power only when wielded at the right moment. So I tucked the trust documents into my safe at home and returned to building JP Consulting now with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that no matter how successful I became, Margaret would never be able to claim I'd relied on family money or connections to get there. 3 years passed in a blur of challenging projects and hard-won victories. JP Consulting's reputation grew steadily, and with it, my confidence in the empire I'd built from absolutely nothing. I'd proven everything my father had wanted me to prove, that I was capable, strategic, and strong enough to succeed entirely on my own merit. The scared, broken woman who'd sat in that dark apartment 5 years ago felt like a distant memory, someone I'd been in another lifetime. On a Wednesday morning in early October, I arrived at my office to find my assistant, Rebecca, hovering near my door with an expression I'd learned to recognize as, something interesting just happened. She was 26, brilliant at reading people, and had an instinct for which opportunities deserved my immediate attention versus which could wait. You're going to want to see this, nurse, she said, handing me a printed email with barely contained excitement. It came in last night through our general inquiry form, but the sender credentials checked out. It's legitimate. I took the paper and felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. The email header read, Parker Home Supplies, Strategic Partnership Inquiry, and my eyes caught on that name like a thorn. I hadn't heard anything about Parker Home Supplies in 5 years, had deliberately avoided news about the company, or my family had built my entire professional life in a separate sphere, where the Parker name held no power over me. The email was professionally written, clearly drafted by someone in their corporate communications department. It explained that Parker Home Supplies was seeking to engage a strategic consulting partner to optimize operational efficiency and explore new market opportunities. They'd researched firms specializing in business transformation, and JP Consulting's track record had impressed them. Would we be interested in discussing a potential partnership? I read it 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of irony. Margaret was asking for my help. She had no idea that JP Consulting belonged to the daughter she'd erased, that Jessica Park was Jessica Parker, that the woman who'd built a reputation for rescuing failing companies was the same woman Margaret had dismissed as nothing more than adequate operational management. Rebecca, pull everything publicly available on Parker Home Supplies, I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. Financial reports, press releases, industry analysis, market position. I want a complete picture of their current status by end of day. She nodded and disappeared, and I sat at my desk, staring at that email, my mind racing through possibilities. This could be a trap, some elaborate scheme if Margaret had somehow discovered my identity. But that seemed unlikely. I'd been meticulous about separating Jessica Park from Jessica Parker, using my father's maiden name, building my business in different markets, ensuring our paths never crossed. More likely, this was exactly what it appeared to be: a struggling company reaching out to a consultant they'd never connected to their past. By 5 o'clock, Rebecca had compiled a comprehensive dossier that painted a devastating picture. Parker Home Supply's market share had been declining steadily for 3 years. Their stock price had dropped 40% from its peak. 2 major clients had recently terminated contracts, and industry publications were speculating about potential bankruptcy if the downward trend continued. Margaret's leadership was being questioned in business journals with phrases like outdated management strategies and failure to adapt to market changes, appearing with uncomfortable frequency. I spread the financial reports across my desk and saw my father's legacy crumbling in black and white. Everything he'd built with such care, such strategic brilliance, was falling apart under Margaret's arrogance and Andrew's incompetence. The supply chain efficiencies I'd implemented years ago had been abandoned. The client relationships I'd carefully nurtured had been neglected. New competitors had moved into markets Parker Home Supplies had once dominated, and from what I could see, Margaret's response had been to double down on the same failing strategies rather than adapt. Part of me felt vindicated. Margaret had been so certain that I was the problem, that removing me would allow the company to flourish under her vision and Andrew's supposed brilliance. Instead, my absence had revealed exactly how much invisible work I'd been doing, how many disasters I'd been quietly preventing, how essential my supposedly adequate operational management had actually been. But another part of me felt genuinely sad. This was my father's company. These were products he'd developed, relationships he'd built, a legacy he'd poured his life into creating. Watching it fail because of Margaret's pride and incompetence felt like watching him die all over again. I picked up my phone and called Martin. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear the smile in his voice when he recognized my number. "Jessica, I was wondering when you'd call." "You knew about this?" "Oh, wait," I said. It wasn't a question. I knew Parker Home Supplies was struggling. I may have mentioned JP Consulting's name to one of their board members at a conference last month. His tone carried barely concealed satisfaction. "I thought you deserved the opportunity to see what Margaret built without you, or rather what she destroyed." I looked at the email again, at the formal request for help from a company that had thrown me away like garbage 5 years ago. "I'm going to accept the meeting." "Under Jessica Park?" Martin asked carefully. "Under Jessica Park," I confirmed. "They asked for JP Consulting's expertise. They'll get it. They just won't know they're getting it from the daughter Margaret said didn't deserve to be part of the family." Martin was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried both pride and warning. "Be careful, Jessica. Going back into that building, seeing them again, it might be harder than you think." "I'm not the woman they threw away anymore," I said firmly. "I'm someone they need. There's a difference." I hung up and drafted a professional response, accepting the invitation for an initial consultation meeting. My assistant sent it within minutes, and the reply came back before I left the office that evening. A formal meeting invitation complete with agenda and attendee list that made my hands shake when I read it. Parker board session, CEO Margaret Parker, VP Andrew Parker, and consulting team. Conference room, 10 a.m. sharp. I was going back to Parker Home Supplies. Back to the boardroom where Margaret had erased me. But this time, I would walk in as their equal, maybe even their superior, and they would have absolutely no idea who I really was. I stared at the meeting invitation on my screen, my calendar reminder glowing accusingly. Parker Home Supplies consultation, 10 a.m. Friday. 3 days away. 3 days until I walked back into the building where Margaret had destroyed me, except this time as someone she needed. The irony was almost too perfect. But Thursday night's sleep eluded me completely. I lay awake running through scenarios, preparing responses, building walls around the emotions threatening to break through my professional facade. At 3 in the morning, I gave up pretending and got dressed. My car seemed to drive itself to Riverside Cemetery parking under the familiar oak tree as dawn approached. I hadn't visited my father's grave in over a year, too busy proving myself, building my empire, becoming someone he'd be proud of. But now, hours before facing Margaret again, I needed him. I stood before his headstone in the pre-dawn darkness, my phone's flashlight illuminating his name carved in weathering granite. "I'm going back tomorrow, Dad," I whispered, "back to where she erased me. But I'm different now. I'm everything you taught me to be." "He would be very proud of you." I spun around to find Pastor Reynolds standing nearby, older and frailer than I remembered from the funeral 7 years ago, but his eyes still kind and knowing. He carried a thermos of coffee and wore the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Pastor Reynolds, what are you doing here at this hour?" "I could ask you the same question," he replied, gently moving beside me. "But I think I know. Tomorrow's a big day. You're going back to face them." He paused, studying my face. "Your father told me things, Jessica. Things he made me promise to keep secret until you were ready to fight." Those specific words made my breath catch. He reached into his coat and pulled out a yellowed envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting. Beneath it, "For Jessica when she's ready to fight." "Your father came to me 3 days before he died," Pastor Reynolds said quietly. "He was carrying a terrible burden. He gave me this and made me promise to give it to you when you were strong enough. When I heard you were returning to Parker Home Supplies, I knew it was time." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and unfolded several pegs of my father's careful handwriting. "My dearest Jessica, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and Pastor Reynolds has judged you're finally strong enough to know the truth. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you believe about our family." I kept reading as my legs grew weak. My father had discovered financial irregularities 3 weeks before his death, Margaret systematically forging his signature for 15 years, creating shell companies, embezzling funds, building a secret financial empire from stolen resources. I confronted her with the evidence. She didn't deny it at first. She told me it was her insurance policy, her protection. She said I'd given everything to the business and nothing to her, that she deserved this compensation. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to continue. When I said I was going to lawyers, she changed tactics. She told me I was losing my mind, that stress was making me paranoid. She said if I pursued this, she'd have me declared incompetent and take everything. She'd destroy my legacy with scandal and accusations of senility. The next paragraph shattered me. "I'm meeting with lawyers next Tuesday to begin a formal investigation. I've hidden evidence where Margaret can't find it, and I've taken steps to protect you. But the stress of knowing the woman I loved has been systematically destroying everything I built. I'm not sure I'll survive it. My chest hurts constantly. I can't sleep. The doctor says my blood pressure is dangerously high, that I'm at serious risk if I don't reduce stress. But how can I when my entire life has been revealed as a lie?" Tears streamed down my face as I read the final paragraph. "If I don't make it to Tuesday, if something happens before I can expose Margaret, know this: you are the best thing I ever created. You have my integrity, my work ethic, my strategic mind. Margaret will come for you. Eventually, she can't help herself. When she does, be stronger than I was. Don't let her gaslight you. Don't let her destroy you. Fight, my darling girl. Fight for truth, for justice, for the legacy we could have built together." The letter fell from my hands. My father hadn't died of random heart failure during a stressful period. He died from the stress of discovering his wife was a criminal, that his marriage was a lie, that everything he'd built was being stolen. And Margaret had let him die carrying that knowledge, had probably counted on the stress killing him before he could expose her. She hadn't just erased me from the company. She'd killed my father. Pastor Reynolds sat beside me, his hand on my shoulder as I sobbed. "Now you know," he said quietly. "Now you understand what you're really fighting for tomorrow. Not just your place in the company, but your father's truth. His legacy. His..." justice. I wiped my tears and picked up the letter with shaking hands, folding it carefully and placing it back in the envelope. Tomorrow I would walk into that boardroom. Tomorrow I would face the woman who'd murdered my father as surely as if she'd held a weapon to his chest. And she would have no idea that the consultant she'd invited was the daughter who finally knew the truth. I don't know how long I sat on that stone bench with Pastor Reynolds beside me, my father's letter clutched in my shaking hands. The sky gradually lightened from black to grey to the pale pink of dawn, and still I couldn't move. 7 years. For 7 years I'd believed my father died of natural causes during a stressful time. I'd mourned him as someone who'd left too soon, whose heart had simply given out. But the truth was so much worse. He'd been murdered by stress, by betrayal, by the woman who'd promised to love him, and he died alone with that knowledge, unable to protect his children from the predator, sleeping beside him. "Take your time," Pastor Reynolds said softly. "There's no rush. The sun's coming up, and God knows you've earned the right to grieve." But I couldn't stay. The cemetery suddenly felt suffocating, the weight of my father's grave pressing down on me like physical force. I stood abruptly, nearly stumbling, and mumbled something that might have been thanks to Pastor Reynolds before walking quickly back to my car. I heard him call after me, concerned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If I stopped moving, I would shatter completely. I made it to my car, slid behind the wheel, and locked the doors before the dam finally broke. I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since the night Margaret erased me from Parker Home Supplies. These weren't neat, quiet tears that could be wiped away and hidden. These were body-racking sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, the kind of grief that had been building for 7 years and could no longer be contained. I cried for my father, who died knowing the truth, but unable to fight it. I cried for the injustice of a good man destroyed by the person he trusted most. I cried for the daughter who'd never known her father had been protecting her, even as he died. The sun was fully up by the time the tears finally slowed. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized myself. My eyes were swollen and red. My careful makeup destroyed my professional facade, completely shattered. I looked like what I was, a woman who just discovered her father had been murdered by stress and betrayal, and that the murderer had gotten away with it for 7 years. My phone sat in the cup holder, and I picked it up with hands that still trembled. I scrolled out to Martin's number and hit call before I could second-guess myself. It was barely 6 in the morning, but somehow I knew he'd answer. He always answered when it mattered. "Jessica," he said immediately, his voice alert despite the early hour. "What's wrong? Did you know?" My voice came out hoarse, broken. "Did you know how he really died?" There was a long pause, and I heard Martin take a deep breath. "Pastor Reynolds gave you the letter." "Answer the question." I couldn't keep the edge of fury from my voice. "Did you know that Margaret killed him? That she let the stress of discovering her crimes literally destroy his heart, and then she just continued, kept embezzling, kept lying, kept destroying everything he built while he was barely cold in the ground?" "Yes," Martin said quietly, and that single word felt like another betrayal. "Your father called me the night before he died. It was late past midnight. He could barely speak, Jessica. His voice was so weak, so defeated. He told me everything about the embezzlement, about confronting Margaret, about her threats. He said, 'Martin, I don't think I'm going to make it to Tuesday. My chest feels like it's being crushed and I can't stop it.' I begged him to go to the hospital, but he refused. He said if he went, Margaret would have him committed, would claim he was having a mental breakdown. I pressed my hand against my mouth, trying to hold back another wave of sobs. He asked me to protect you from Margaret's destruction when the time came," Martin continued. He said, "She'll come for Jessica eventually. She's too much like me, too capable, too ethical, too much of a threat. When Margaret destroys her, and she will, you have to be there to help her rise again. Promise me, Martin. Promise me you won't let Margaret destroy my daughter the way she destroyed me." "So, you knew," I said, my voice flat now, drained of emotion. "You knew what she was for 7 years, and you just watched. You let her run that company, let her erase me, let her pretend to be some kind of business leader when she's nothing but a thief and a murderer." "I kept my promise to your father," Martin replied, and there was steel in his voice now. "He didn't ask me to destroy Margaret. He asked me to protect you, to help you become strong enough to survive what she would do to you and then to reclaim what was rightfully yours. Not through revenge, Jessica, but through becoming so undeniably successful that when the time came, you could take everything back legally, strategically, completely." I leaned my head against the steering wheel, my father's letter still clutched in my other hand. She can't get away with this. She can't just continue living like she didn't murder him. "She won't," Martin said firmly. "But Jessica, listen to me carefully. If you go into that meeting tomorrow, driven by rage, by the need for immediate revenge, you'll lose. Margaret is cunning and ruthless, and she's had 7 years to consolidate her power. But if you go in strategically, if you attend that meeting as the professional consultant they invited, if you identify every weakness in that company and make yourself indispensable to their survival, then you wait for the right moment. That's when you win. That's when you take back everything she stole, not just from you, but from your father." I sat up slowly, wiping my face with the back of my hand. My reflection in the mirror still looked destroyed, but something was shifting inside me. The grief wasn't going away, but it was transforming into something else, something colder and more focused. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "Go to that meeting tomorrow as planned, analyze their operations, show them exactly how badly they're failing and exactly how you can fix it. Become the consultant they can't live without. Then, when they're dependent on you, when Margaret needs you more than her pride can bear to admit, that's when you reveal who you are. That's when you show her that the daughter she threw away is the only thing standing between her and complete destruction." I thought about my father's letter, about his final words, asking me to fight. He hadn't asked me to burn everything down in a fit of rage. He'd asked me to be smarter than Margaret, stronger than her, better than her. He'd asked me to win, not just to destroy. "She took everything from him," I said quietly, and my voice had changed. The grief was still there, but it was cased in ice, now sharp and dangerous. His company, his health, his peace of mind, his life. She took my father from me, she took my career, she took my family, and she's been living with no consequences for 7 years, probably sleeping soundly every night while my father is in the ground. "Yes," Martin agreed. "So what are you going to do about it?" I looked at my reflection again, at the woman with swollen eyes and tear-stained cheeks, and watched as she transformed before my eyes into something harder, more determined, absolutely focused. "I'm going to take back everything she stole, legally, strategically, completely, and when I'm done, she'll know exactly what she lost when she threw me away." I spent Friday preparing with clinical precision. The grief was locked away in a compartment I could access later. Right now, I needed to be Jessica Park, CEO of JP Consulting, the consultant, Parker Home Supplies desperately needed. I arrived at 9:45, 15 minutes early. The building looked exactly the same, but I was different. The woman who'd been escorted out 5 years ago had been broken, invisible, desperately seeking validation. The woman walking through these doors now wore a tailored black suit that cost more than a month of her old salary and moved with the confidence of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. The receptionist didn't recognize me. Why would she? I'd been furniture back then. Now I was Jessica Park, and she directed me to conference room A with professional courtesy. My old floor. The floor where Margaret had erased me. Through the glass walls, I could see them assembled. Margaret at the head of the table, Andrew to her right, looking uncomfortable, and 6 board members I recognised from that terrible day. I pushed open the door and walked in, like I owned the place, which technically I did. "Ms. Park," Margaret said, standing to shake my hand. She looked older, more lines, more grey, but her grip was still firm, her smile still practiced and cold. Her eyes swept over me with dismissive cataloguing consultant outsider, temporary necessity. She had no idea she was shaking hands with the daughter she'd destroyed. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table and opened my portfolio. For the next 40 minutes, I delivered my presentation. Every slide was backed by irrefutable data. I showed them how their supply chain had become bloated and inefficient, adding 17% to product costs. I demonstrated how management had grown top-heavy while frontline staff was cut. I presented market share data showing them hemorrhaging customers to more agile competitors. The silence when I finished was absolute. Margaret's smile had frozen her knuckles white, gripping her pen. I showed them projected cash flow at their current trajectory. Bankruptcy within 18 months wasn't a possibility, it was inevitable. "This analysis is overly pessimistic," Margaret said tightly. "We're going through a temporary adjustment." "The data doesn't support that conclusion," I interrupted calmly. "This isn't temporary. This is systematic failure of leadership that's been compounding for years. The question is whether you're willing to make the changes necessary to survive." Andrew suddenly stood up, his face completely white, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Wait," he whispered. "Jessica." The room froze. Recognition dawned on Margaret's face like a slow-motion car crash. Confusion. "Who is Jessica Memory? My daughter was named Jessica." Focus studying my face. Then shock, absolute and complete, as she realised the consultant dismantling her company was the daughter she'd thrown away. Her expression shifted from shock to rage instantly. Red flooded her cheeks, her hand shaking. "Everyone out," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the silence like ice. "Now, except you, Jessica." The board members scrambled to leave. Andrew hesitated, looking between us with guilt or fear, but Margaret's glare sent him fleeing. Within seconds, the room was empty, except us sitting at opposite ends like generals before war. I held her gaze and waited. Let her speak first. Margaret stood, slowly gathered her materials, and walked toward the door. She paused with her back to me. "This changes nothing," she said quietly. "You're still not welcome in this family. And if you think you can destroy what I've built, you'll find out exactly how wrong you are." She left, and I sat alone in the conference room where I'd been erased 5 years ago. I'd done it, walked back in, delivered the truth, watched Margaret realise the daughter she'd thrown away had become someone she needed. It should have felt like victory. Instead, I felt hollow. I drove back to my office and stayed late, avoiding my empty apartment. By 11, my team had gone home and the office was dark, except my desk lamp. That's when I noticed a framed photo in my drawer, a family dinner from 10 years ago. Margaret stood centre regal, Andrew, to her right, confident, my father to her left, and even in the photo I could see the strain around his eyes, the stress of discovering his wife's betrayal. And there, at the very edge, barely included, stood me. 32, wearing a conservative dress, my smile tight and uncertain, my posture defensive, trying so hard to prove I deserved to be in that frame. I stared at that younger version of myself and felt profound sadness. Not for what happened, she'd survived and thrived, but for all the years wasted believing her worth came from their approval. "I spent 32 years trying to earn your love," I said aloud to the photo. "Trying to be good enough for you to see me. Working 60-hour weeks, covering for Andrew's mistakes, always hoping that maybe this time would finally be enough." I removed the photo from its frame, turned it over, and picked up a pen. On the back, in firm letters, I wrote 3 words: "I choose me." And then I placed it face down in my drawer and closed it. Not throwing it away, the past deserved to be remembered, but putting it where it belonged. Behind me. Finished. The hollow feeling filled with something else. Quiet satisfaction. A sense of rightness. For the first time, I didn't need Margaret's validation to know I was valuable. I didn't need Andrew's support to know I was capable. I had built all of this myself, and it was mine, in a way nothing connected to them could ever be. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You humiliated Mum," in front of the board. "This is war. Andrew." I smiled and set it down. Let it be war then. I'd spent 5 years preparing for this battle, and I knew something they didn't. I'd already won. They just didn't know it yet. I should have taken Andrew's warning more seriously. I'd been so confident after that boardroom confrontation, so certain that I held all the cards that I underestimated exactly how vicious Margaret could be when cornered. The war began not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet, surgical strikes designed to bleed me slowly. The first call came on Wednesday morning, 4 days after I'd walked out of Parker Home Supplies. My assistant Rebecca transferred the call from David Chen, CEO of Meridian Solutions, the company where I'd first rebuilt myself 5 years ago, and now one of JP Consulting's anchor clients with a contract worth $200,000 annually. "Jessica?" David said, his voice strained with an awkwardness I'd never heard from him before. "I need to talk to you about our contract renewal." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "David, our renewal isn't scheduled for discussion until next month. What's going on?" "I've been getting calls," he said carefully. "Questions about JP Consulting's business practices, about whether you might have used proprietary information from your previous employer to build your consulting methods. People are asking if working with your firm might expose us to legal liability." I gripped the phone tighter. "What people? Who's been calling you?" "I can't say. But Jessica, I've built Meridian on ethical practices. I can't afford even the appearance of impropriety. I'm going to have to cancel our contract, effective immediately. I'm sorry." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat, frozen at my desk, staring at the phone like it had transformed into a weapon. One major client gone. But surely that was just an anomaly, just David being overly cautious. Then Rebecca appeared at my door, her face pale. "Jessica, I just got off the phone with Harrison Tech. They're cancelling their contract too. Something about integrity concerns and needing to reassess their consulting partnerships." Before I could process that, my phone rang again. This time it was Amanda Rodriguez from Apex Manufacturing, another major client. She didn't even let me speak before launching into an apologetic explanation about how their legal department had advised them to pause all consulting relationships pending review of potential intellectual property conflicts. 3 major clients, gone in less than 2 hours. Contracts worth over $600,000 annually, representing nearly 60% of JP Consulting's revenue, evaporated like smoke. I called Martin immediately. "She's destroying me," I said without preamble. "Margaret is systematically contacting my clients and spreading rumours. How did she even know who they were?" "Private investigator," Martin said grimly. "I've been making calls. She hired someone to dig into JP Consulting the day after your presentation client list. Financial records, everything publicly available, and some things that shouldn't be. She's telling people you stole proprietary methodologies from Parker Home Supplies when you worked there, that any company using your consulting services is at risk of lawsuits. That's absurd. I developed those methodologies over 5 years of independent work. She has no legal basis." "She doesn't need legal basis," Martin interrupted. "She just needs to create enough doubt, enough fear of potential litigation that companies decide you're not worth the risk. Corporate clients are terrified of lawsuits, Jessica. Even the threat is enough to make them run." I spent the rest of the day on the phone trying to salvage relationships, explaining to nervous clients that Margaret's accusations were baseless, offering to provide documentation of how I'd developed my consulting frameworks entirely independently. Most listened politely and said they'd take it under consideration. None committed to maintaining their contracts. By Friday, the formal legal assault began. A courier delivered a thick envelope to our office at 3 p.m. Inside was a cease and desist letter on official Parker Home Supplies letterhead, signed by their legal team and addressed to JP Consulting and all current and prospective clients. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation wrapped in corporate language. It claimed that Jessica Parker, during her employment at Parker Home Supplies, had been exposed to proprietary and confidential operational methodologies, strategic frameworks, and trade secrets that formed the core of Parker Company's competitive advantage. It further claimed that JP Consulting's success was built entirely on misappropriation of Parker Home Supplies' intellectual property, and that any company utilizing JP Consulting services was potentially liable for contributory infringement and tortious interference. The letter threatened lawsuits against any company that continued working with JP Consulting after receiving notice of these claims. It demanded that I immediately cease using any methodologies that derived from, resembled, or incorporated anything I'd learned during my tenure at Parker Home Supplies, which, given that I'd worked there for 10 years, essentially meant ceasing all business operations. My lawyer read it and winced. "This is mostly bluster," she said carefully. "Their actual legal standing is weak. But Jessica, they don't need to win a lawsuit. They just need to threaten one. Most companies will drop you rather than risk even the possibility of litigation." She was right. By Monday morning, 2 more clients had cancelled, apologetically citing the cease and desist letter and their legal department's recommendations. My remaining team watched nervously as our client roster dwindled their energy in the office, shifting from confident productivity to anxious survival mode. I called an emergency meeting with my core team on Tuesday afternoon. My CFO, Sarah Mitchell, had spent the morning running worst-case financial scenarios, and her expression told me everything before she even opened her spreadsheet. "We're hemorrhaging cash," she said bluntly, projecting our numbers onto the conference room screen. "With the contracts we've lost, we're down 60% in revenue, but our fixed costs remain the same: salaries, rent, insurance, operational expenses. We have enough reserves to last maybe 2 months at our current burn rate, 3 if we make cuts immediately." "What kind of cuts?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Staff reductions, probably 40% of the team to match our reduced revenue. Even then, if we lose one more major client, we'll have to shut down by end of quarter. There won't be enough revenue to sustain even a skeleton crew." I looked around the table at the people I'd personally recruited, trained, and built into an exceptional team. These weren't just employees. They were professionals who'd taken chances on a relatively new firm because they believed in what we were building. And now, I was going to have to tell them that my family vendetta was destroying their livelihoods. "Give me 48 hours before we make any decisions," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to explore all options." After the meeting ended and everyone filed out, Sarah lingered at the door. "Jessica, I need to ask, is what they're saying true? Did you use Parker Home Supplies methodologies to build this firm?" The question stung more than I expected. "No," I said firmly. "Everything we've built here, every framework and strategy I developed independently over 5 years of work. Parker Home Supplies taught me operational basics, yes, but what we do here is completely original. This is Margaret trying to destroy me because I had the audacity to succeed without her." Sarah nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. That was Margaret's real genius. She didn't need proof, just enough uncertainty to make people question everything. That night, alone in my office again, I stared at the financial projections Sarah had left behind. Margaret was doing to me exactly what she'd done to my father, using systematic pressure, legal threats, and whisper campaigns to destroy someone who threatened her control. She'd killed my father with stress, and now she was trying to kill my business the same way. My phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and I answered, expecting more bad news. "Jessica," she said, her voice tight with stress. "I just got a call from our last major client. They're cancelling too, effective immediately. She paused, and I could hear her breathing, trying to stay professional. If we lose one more client, we'll have to shut down by end of quarter. What do we do? I told Sarah I'd have an answer by morning, but the truth was I had no answers. After she hung up, I sat in the darkness of my office, staring at spreadsheets that all led to the same conclusion. JP Consulting was dying and Margaret was winning. Everything I'd built over 5 years was crumbling exactly the way she'd planned, and I was powerless to stop it. It was nearly 11 when I heard the knock on my office door. I assumed it was the building's security guard making rounds, but when I looked up, Andrew stood in the doorway. He looked terrible, hair dishevelled, shirt wrinkled, eyes red-rimmed, like he'd been crying or hadn't slept in days. Possibly both. "Get out," I said flatly, turning back to my computer. "If you're here to gloat for Margaret, save it. She's already won." "Jessica, please, I need to talk to you." "But Dad," his voice cracked on my name, and something in that brokenness made me pause. "There's nothing to talk about. Your mother is destroying my business, and based on your text last week, you're cheering her on. So unless you're here to tell me she's calling off her attack dogs, get out of my office." I helped her. The words came out in a rush, desperate and anguished. "The smear campaign, the legal threats, I gave her your client list. I told her exactly who to target, how to pressure them. Jessica, I'm the reason you're losing everything." I stood slowly, my hands flat on my desk to keep them from shaking with rage. "You what?" Andrew took a step into the office, and I could see tears streaming down his face now. "I gave her your client information. I helped her draft the cease and desist letter. I told her which companies would be most vulnerable to legal intimidation. I did all of it because I was..." His voice broke completely. "Because I'm a coward. Because I've always been too weak to stand up to her. And when she told me to help destroy you, I did it." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that words seemed inadequate. My brother, the person who'd sat silently while Margaret erased me 5 years ago, had actively participated in destroying everything I'd rebuilt. "Get out," I finally managed, my voice dangerously quiet. "Get out before I call security and have you thrown out." "Wait, please." Andrew pulled something from his jacket pocket, a flash drive, and set it on the edge of my desk. "I've been helping you too. For the past 3 weeks, I've been feeding information to your lawyer. Proof that the methodologies Margaret claims are proprietary to Parker Home Supplies are actually standard industry practices. Documentation showing that everything you built at JP Consulting is completely original. I've been working with your legal team to dismantle every claim in that cease and desist letter." I stared at the flash drive, then back at Andrew's tear-stained face, trying to process this information. "Why would you help her destroy me and help me defend myself at the same time? That makes no sense." "Because I'm torn apart," Andrew said, his voice raw with emotion. "Because Mum has controlled me my entire life, and I've never had the courage to say no to her. But watching what she's doing to you, seeing her use the same tactics she used on Dad..." He stopped, pressing his hands against his eyes. "She killed him, Jessica. Not with her hands, but with her lies and her manipulation and her greed. And now she's trying to do the same thing to you, and I can't be part of that anymore." Something in my chest cracked open at hearing Andrew finally acknowledge what Margaret had done to our father. "You knew all this time, you knew what she did to Dad." "I found his letter to Pastor Reynolds 2 years ago," Andrew admitted. "Mum had a copy hidden in her office safe. I read it and I realised everything. The embezzlement, the forgeries, how the stress of discovering her crimes killed him. And I did nothing. I just put it back and pretended I'd never seen it because I was too afraid of what would happen if I confronted her." He moved closer, his hands clasped like he was praying. "But I can't do nothing anymore. I've been too weak to stand up to Margaret my whole life, but watching her destroy you the same way she destroyed Dad has finally broken something in me. I can't bring him back, Jessica. But I can stop her from taking you down too. I picked up the flash drive, turning it over in my fingers. What's on here? Everything, Andrew said. Forged documents showing how she's been manipulating company finances. Proof of the fake legal claims in the cease and desist letter. Evidence she's been embezzling for 15 years, exactly like Dad discovered. Email chains between her and the private investigator she hired to dig up dirt on you. Phone records of her calling your clients to spread lies. All of it. My hands started shaking as the implications sank in. This wasn't just evidence to defend JP Consulting. This was evidence that could destroy Margaret completely criminally. If this gets out, she'll go to prison. I know, Andrew said quietly. And maybe she should. Maybe that's what justice looks like. He took a shaky breath. But there's something else you need to know. Something I found in Dad's papers that changes everything. What are you talking about? The Parker Family Trust. Dad didn't just give you 40% of the company, like Martin told you. Andrew's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There's a conversion clause buried in the trust documents. If Parker Home Supplies faces insolvency proceedings, your non-voting preferred shares automatically convert to voting common stock, which means if the company goes bankrupt, I suddenly have 40% voting power. I finished, my mind racing through the implications. With Margaret at 35% and Andrew at 25%, that would make me the largest voting shareholder. I could vote Margaret out. I could take control of the entire company. Andrew nodded. Dad built in a failsafe. He knew that if Mum ever drove the company to the edge of bankruptcy, you would be the one with the power to save it or let it die. He made sure you'd have the choice. I looked at my brother. Really looked at him and saw someone I'd never seen before. Not the incompetent VP who'd taken credit for my work. Not the coward who'd stood silent while Margaret destroyed me. But someone broken and guilt-ridden, finally trying to do the right thing, even though it was years too late. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because you need to know what weapons you have before you decide how to fight, Andrew said. He gestured to the flash drive. That has everything you need to destroy Mum legally. And now you know about the conversion clause, which gives you the power to destroy her professionally if Parker Home Supplies fails. He met my eyes and I saw genuine remorse there. I can't undo the damage I've helped cause, but I can give you the tools to win. What you do with them is up to you. Andrew left my office at midnight, and I spent the next 3 hours going through every file on that flash drive. There were hundreds of documents, emails, financial records, legal correspondence, forensic accounting, reports that Andrew had apparently been compiling for months. But it was a single PDF buried in a folder labelled Trust Documents, Additional Clauses, that made my hands start shaking. I read the clause 3 times each pass, revealing new implications that seemed almost too good to be true. Then I called Martin, not caring that it was 3 a.m. Jessica. His voice was alert immediately, the way it always was when I called. What's wrong? Did you know about the conversion clause? I asked without preamble. There was a long pause. How did you find out about that? Answer the question, Martin. Did you know that my preferred shares convert to voting stock if Parker Home Supplies faces insolvency? Your father mentioned something about additional protections built into the trust, but he never showed me the specific language, Martin said carefully. He said there were clauses that would activate under certain conditions and that I'd know when the time came. Is that time now? I need you to look at these documents tonight, and I need our lawyers on call first thing tomorrow morning. I was already forwarding the files as we spoke. Andrew gave me everything, the full trust agreement with all amendments and addendums. Martin, if I'm reading this correctly, my father didn't just give me ownership. He gave me a nuclear option. 6 hours later, I sat in a conference room, fume with Martin my corporate attorney Patricia Chen, and a trust and estate specialist named Robert Morrison, who Patricia had brought in for his expertise. The trust documents were spread across the table, and Robert had spent the past 2 hours analysing every word with the kind of meticulous attention that expensive lawyers are known for. "It's ironclad," Robert finally said, sitting back and removing his reading glasses. "Your father was remarkably sophisticated in how he structured this. The conversion clause is triggered automatically if Parker Home Supplies meets any of 3 conditions. First, if the company files for bankruptcy protection. Second, if the company's cash reserves fall below 3 months of operating expenses for 2 consecutive quarters. Or third, if the company receives a going concern warning from its auditors." "And where does Parker Home Supplies stand right now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the financial data Andrew had included on the flash drive. Patricia pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. Based on their most recent quarterly filing and the internal financial documents Andrew provided, they're currently at 4.2 months of cash reserves, down from 7 months this time last year. Their burn rate has accelerated significantly in the past 6 months. If current trends continue, they'll hit the 3-month threshold by the end of next quarter. 6 months, I said quietly. They're 6 months away from triggering the conversion. Potentially less, Robert added. If they lose another major client or have any unexpected expenses, it could happen sooner. And once those shares convert, you become the largest voting shareholder. Margaret has 35%, Andrew has 25%, and you'd have 40% of voting common stock. You could call for a vote of no confidence and remove Margaret as CEO. Martin was watching me carefully, and I could see the question in his eyes before he asked it. "What do you want to do, Jessica? You have options now. You could file a motion right now to force an emergency shareholders meeting, argue that the company is in imminent danger of insolvency and potentially trigger the conversion immediately. With the evidence Andrew gave you about Margaret's embezzlement and mismanagement, you could make a strong case." "Or," I prompted because I could hear the alternative in his tone. "Or you could wait," Martin continued. "Let the company continue its natural decline. The conversion happens automatically. When the cash reserves hit the threshold, you don't have to do anything. Margaret won't even know it's coming until it's too late." Patricia leaned forward. "There's a third option. You could let Margaret know about the conversion clause now. Not through legal channels, but privately. Let her understand that her time is limited, that every day the company declines brings you closer to having the power to remove her. The psychological pressure alone might force her to make mistakes." I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city where I'd rebuilt myself from nothing. JP Consulting was still hemorrhaging clients, still facing potential shutdown by end of quarter. Margaret had spent the past months systematically destroying everything I'd built using every dirty tactic she could find. She'd done the same thing to my father and it had killed him. The old Jessica, the one who'd been erased 5 years ago, would have wanted immediate revenge. She would have filed that motion, forced that vote taken control as quickly as possible. But I wasn't that person anymore. I'd learned patience. I'd learned strategy. And most importantly, I'd learned that the sweetest victories came not from destroying your enemies quickly, but from letting them destroy themselves while you watched. "Neither," I finally said, turning back to face them. "I'm not going to force an immediate vote, and I'm not going to wait silently for the conversion to happen automatically." "Then what?" Martin asked. "I'm going to let Margaret know I have this power," I said, and I could hear my voice taking on the cold, calculated tone I'd developed over 5 years of business warfare. "I'm going to make sure she understands exactly what's coming for her, that every decision she makes, every client she loses, every financial misstep, brings her closer to the day when I have the votes to remove her from the company my father built. I want her to feel the pressure mounting. I want her to panic." Patricia looked concerned. "That's a risky strategy. If she knows what's coming, she might take drastic action, sell assets, restructure the company, find ways to artificially inflate the cash reserves." "Let her try," I replied. Every desperate move she makes will only highlight her incompetence to the board and shareholders. And here's what Margaret doesn't understand about me anymore. I'm not the desperate daughter begging for approval. I'm the woman who built a successful consulting firm from nothing. Even if JE Consulting fails because of her sabotage, I can rebuild. I've done it before. But Parker Home Supplies, that company, is all she has. It's her entire identity, her whole sense of power and control. I picked up the trust documents, feeling their weight in my hands. My father gave me this power not so I could use it immediately, but so I could use it wisely. He wanted Margaret to understand what it feels like to watch everything you've built slip away while being powerless to stop it. He wanted her to experience the same fear and helplessness he felt when she destroyed him. Martin smiled slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. You want her to come to you. You want her so desperate, so terrified of losing everything that she has no choice but to ask for your help. Exactly, I said. I want Margaret Parker to walk into my office just like she made me walk out of hers 5 years ago and beg me to save her. I want her to feel what powerlessness feels like. And then, when she's at her lowest, when she finally understands what she took from me and from my father, that's when I'll decide whether she deserves mercy. The year that followed was a study in controlled psychological warfare. I didn't announce the conversion clause publicly, but I made sure Margaret knew. A carefully worded letter from my attorneys delivered by courier to her home, explaining that as a trust beneficiary, I'd been reviewing the complete trust documents and had recently become aware of certain provisions that would activate under specific financial conditions. The letter was professional, almost casual, but the message was clear. I know what's coming, and so should you. JP Consulting survived Margaret's sabotage barely. With Andrew's evidence, my lawyers systematically dismantled every claim in the cease and desist letter. 3 former clients returned once the legal cloud lifted, and I spent 6 months rebuilding what Margaret had tried to destroy. The company was smaller, now leaner, but stable. And I'd learned an important lesson about diversification and protecting myself from coordinated attacks. Meanwhile, Parker Home Supplies continued its slow decline. I tracked their quarterly reports, religiously watching the cash reserves dwindle from 4 months to 3.8 to 3.3. Each report was a countdown timer ticking toward the moment my shares would convert, and Margaret's control would evaporate. And I knew she was watching the same numbers, feeling the walls closing in. I'd expected her to fight back with more sabotage, more legal attacks. Instead, she went silent. 3 months passed without any contact, and that silence worried me more than her attacks had. Margaret wasn't the type to surrender quietly, which meant she was planning something. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September from Richard Morrison, one of the board members I'd presented to during that first consultation. He'd always been cordial to me, and I suspected he was one of the directors uncomfortable with Margaret's leadership style. "Jessica, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Off the record. Can you meet me somewhere private?" An hour later, we sat in a coffee shop, 20 minutes from Parker Home Supplies headquarters. Richard looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. "Margaret's making a move," he said quietly, sliding a document across the table. "She's negotiating a major loan, and she's calling for a board vote in 3 weeks. I thought you should know." I picked up the document, a term sheet from a company called Titan Capital Partners. The numbers made my blood run cold. $50 million secured by 90% of Parker Home Supplies assets. Interest rate of 18%. Balloon payment due in 18 months. It was financial suicide dressed up as a rescue plan. "This is insane," I said, reading through the predatory terms. "The interest alone would be nearly $9 million annually. Parker Home Supplies doesn't generate enough free cash flow to service this debt. They default within a year." "I know," Richard said grimly. "I've tried to talk her out of it. So, have 2 other board members. But Margaret controls 5 of the 7 seats, and she's determined to push this through. She says it's the only way to avoid insolvency. I studied the terms more carefully, and suddenly the strategy became clear. This wasn't about saving Parker Home Supplies. This was Margaret's scorched earth plan. Take the 50 million, use some of it for immediate operations to avoid triggering the conversion clause funnel, the rest into accounts she controlled, and then let the company default. When Titan Capital seized the assets, there'd be nothing left but an empty shell. My 40% ownership would become 40% of worthless paper. She's going to burn it down, I said aloud. Rather than let me take control, she's going to destroy the company completely and walk away with whatever cash she can extract. Richard nodded. That's my assessment too. And there's something else you should know. Titan Capital has a reputation for asset stripping. They don't rehabilitate struggling companies. They liquidate them for parts. If this loan goes through and Parker Home Supplies has defaults, your father's company won't just fail. It will be dismantled and sold off piece by piece. I felt rage building in my chest, hot and righteous. Margaret was willing to destroy everything my father had built, everything he had poured his life into creating, just to prevent me from reclaiming it. She'd rather see it burn to the ground than admit she'd been wrong to erase me. When's the board vote? I asked. 3 weeks from Thursday, October 19th. Margaret has the votes locked up. Her 5 loyalists will approve anything she puts in front of them. The rest of us are powerless to stop it. I thanked Richard and left the coffee shop with the term sheet clutched in my hand. Back in my car, I called Martin immediately. She's making her move, I said when he answered. Margaret's taking out a predatory loan that will destroy the company within a year. She's scheduled a board vote for 3 weeks from now. Martin was quiet for a long moment. Send me the terms. I'll review them with Patricia. 2 hours later, we were back in that same conference room where we'd analysed the conversion clause. Patricia had the loan documents projected on the screen, her expression growing darker as she read through the terms. This is a death sentence, she said flatly. Even if Parker Home Supplies had healthy margins and strong growth, they couldn't service this debt. With their current trajectory, they'll default within 12 months, possibly sooner. And when they do, Titan Capital will seize everything: intellectual property, equipment, real estate, client contracts, everything. Can we stop it? I asked. You could file an injunction as a shareholder, arguing that the loan violates fiduciary duty by essentially guaranteeing the company's destruction, Patricia said. But that would require revealing your ownership publicly and probably triggering a lengthy legal battle. Margaret's lawyers would argue she's trying to prevent immediate insolvency, and courts are generally reluctant to second-guess business decisions. Or, Martin interjected, you could force an emergency shareholder vote. File a motion arguing that a loan of this magnitude, securing 90% of company assets, requires approval from all shareholders, not just the board. That's a stronger legal argument and would force the conversion clause issue into the open. I paced the conference room, my mind racing through scenarios. 3 weeks. That's all the time I had to decide whether to reveal my ownership, trigger a public battle with Margaret, and try to save a company that might not want to be saved. Or I could let the loan go through, watch Parker Home Supplies burn, and walk away knowing Margaret destroyed herself. If that loan goes through, your father's company is finished, Martin said quietly. Everything he built, everyone who depends on those jobs, all of it gone. You have 3 weeks to decide, file an injunction, and reveal your ownership or let it burn and start fresh. I stopped pacing and looked at both of them. There's a third option. What if I let her know I'm aware of the loan, that I understand what she's trying to do, and that I have the power to stop her if I choose? What if I force her to come to me first? Patricia shook her head. That's an enormous gamble. If she calls your bluff and pushes the loan through anyway, you'll have lost your last chance to intervene. Then I better make sure it's not a bluff, I replied. I need to make Margaret understand that destroying Parker Home Supplies won't save her from me. It will just make her destruction more complete. I gave Patricia and Martin 48 hours to prepare the most comprehensive legal filing of their careers. The petition we filed Friday afternoon was 63 pages of meticulously documented arguments, financial analysis, and legal precedent, all building toward one conclusion. Margaret Parker was attempting to commit corporate suicide to spite a minority shareholder, and the court had a duty to intervene. The core argument was elegant. The proposed loan violated fiduciary duty because it virtually guaranteed the company's destruction. We included projections showing that servicing the debt was mathematically impossible. We demonstrated that Titan Capital specialized in asset liquidation, not rehabilitation. And we argued that pledging 90% of company assets required approval from all shareholders, not just a board controlled by the CEO who stood to benefit from the company's failure. We filed at 4:30 Friday, giving Margaret's team the weekend to respond, but not enough time to mount a sophisticated defence. Margaret's lawyers filed their opposition Monday morning, aggressive, dismissive, and fatally flawed. They argued my trust shares were non-voting, that I had no standing, and that courts shouldn't second-guess business decisions. They characterised my petition as vengeful actions of a disgruntled former employee. That's when Patricia revealed the conversion clause. Our reply brief included the complete trust documents with conversion provisions highlighted. We provided expert testimony explaining how the clause worked. And most damaging, we attached Margaret's own loan application to Titan Capital, where she'd disclosed that Parker Home Supplies faced potential insolvency within 6 months, the exact condition triggering conversion. Margaret admitted under oath to the lender that the company is insolvent. Patricia explained, that admission triggers the conversion automatically. Your shares are already voting stock. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning. I arrived at 8:30 with Patricia Martin and 3 associates. Margaret sat opposite with 5 attorneys in identical navy suits. This was the first time we'd been in the same room since that confrontation over a year ago. She looked older, harder, with deep lines around her mouth. When our eyes met, I saw pure hatred and fear. Judge Sarah Martinez presided, a woman in her early 60s with steel grey hair and a no-nonsense demeanour. She'd reviewed all briefs and came prepared with pointed questions. Counsel for the defendant, she began, addressing Margaret's attorney. Your opposition argues Ms. Parker's shares are non-voting, but the trust documents show a conversion clause triggered by insolvency. Your client's loan application admits the company faces insolvency within 6 months. How do you reconcile these facts? Margaret's attorney stood carefully. Your Honour, the loan application described a potential future condition, not current insolvency. The conversion clause hasn't been triggered because the company hasn't actually become insolvent yet. So your argument is Ms. Parker should wait until the company is definitively insolvent, at which point it will be too late to prevent destruction of shareholder value. Judge Martinez's tone made clear what she thought of that logic. Your Honour, the board has business judgment rights to pursue financing. Even financing that guarantees the company's failure, the judge interrupted. She turned to Patricia. Counsel for the plaintiff, what remedy are you seeking? Patricia stood smoothly. Your Honour, 3 things. First, a temporary restraining order preventing next week's board vote. Second, an order requiring a full shareholder meeting where all owners, including trust beneficiaries, can vote on the proposed loan. Third, an order requiring the defendant to disclose all material financial information to Ms. Parker as a major shareholder. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Margaret's attorneys portrayed me as a vindictive outsider. Patricia systematically dismantled every argument with trust documents, financial projections, and Margaret's own admissions. By the end, even I could see which way Judge Martinez was leaning. I'm going to rule from the bench, the judge said, and the courtroom went silent. Having reviewed the evidence and heard arguments, I find that the conversion clause in the Parker Family Trust is valid and enforceable. Furthermore, the defendant's loan application constitutes sufficient admission of insolvency risk to trigger conversion. Therefore, Ms. Parker is a voting shareholder with standing to challenge board decisions. Margaret's face went white, her hands gripping the table. I'm ordering a 30-day delay of any board vote on the Titan Capital loan, Judge Martinez continued. During that time, a mandatory shareholder meeting will be convened where all shareholders, including Ms. Parker, will vote on the proposed financing. Additionally, the defendant is ordered to provide Ms. Parker complete access to all financial records, board minutes, and material documents. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down. Patricia squeezed my arm. Martin smiled with quiet satisfaction, and across the aisle, Margaret's attorneys gathered their materials in stunned silence. We filed into the hallway, and I was walking toward the elevator when I heard Margaret's voice behind me, low and venomous. You think you've won? She'd followed me, her attorneys trailing behind, trying to pull her back. You think you've won? I'll destroy this company before I let you have it. I'll burn everything your father built to the ground rather than watch you take control. You hear me, Jessica, I'll destroy it all. I turned to face her, and for the first time in my life, I looked at my mother without fear or need for her approval. Go ahead, I said calmly. Destroy it. Because the court just gave me the power to rebuild it exactly the way it should have been all along without you. The 30 days between the court ruling and the mandatory shareholder meeting felt endless. Margaret used every hour to shore up her defences, calling in favours from board members, meeting privately with executives. I spent those same days preparing for the most important presentation of my career, not a business proposal, but a reckoning 10 years in the making. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock Friday morning in Parker Home Supply's largest conference room. By 9:30, the room was packed. All 7 board members sat along one side of the massive table. Senior management occupied the opposite side. Faces I recognised from a decade ago, now older, watching nervously. Martin sat beside me, his calm presence steadying. Andrew sat at the far end, carefully avoiding eye contact with both Margaret and me. And at the head of the table, Margaret Parker radiated controlled fury beneath professional composure. The court-appointed mediator, David Chen, called the meeting to order at 10. This emergency shareholder meeting has been convened pursuant to court order to vote on the proposed financing with Titan Capital Partners. All voting shareholders are present. We'll begin with presentation of the loan terms, followed by discussion and formal vote. Margaret's CFO presented the loan details, framing it as necessary capital for expansion. The presentation was polished, professional, and fundamentally dishonest. He mentioned the 18% interest, briefly glossed over the balloon payment, and completely omitted Titan Capital's reputation for asset stripping. When the presentation ended, David Chen opened the floor. Are there questions or concerns regarding the proposed financing? I stood slowly, and the room's attention shifted. Margaret's eyes locked on mine with barely concealed hatred. I have several concerns, I said, my voice steady. But before I address them, everyone in this room needs to understand who I am and what authority I have to be here. Margaret's lawyer started to object, but David Chen held up his hand. Ms. Parker is a voting shareholder with standing. Please continue. My name is Jessica Parker, I said, letting that name hang in the air. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. 10 years ago, I worked at this company as director of operations. I managed supply chains, negotiated contracts, and saved millions in operational efficiencies. And 10 years ago, my mother, Margaret Parker, removed me from all positions, stripped my equity, and had me escorted out by security. The room erupted in whispers. I saw recognition dawning, employees remembering the quiet woman in the corner office. 5 years ago, I founded JP Consulting under my father's maiden name to distance myself from this company, I continued. I built that business from nothing, based solely on my abilities. And I did it all while secretly holding 40% ownership of Parker Home Supplies through a trust my father established before his death. Margaret shot to her feet. This is inappropriate. Sit down, Mrs. Parker, David Chen said firmly. Ms. Parker has the floor. I held up the trust documents. My father placed 40% of this company into a trust with me as beneficiary. He used non-voting preferred shares, but included a conversion clause. If the company faced insolvency, my shares would convert to voting stock. Thanks to my mother's mismanagement, we now face exactly that insolvency. I let that sink in. Which means I currently hold 40% voting power, more than anyone else in this room. And I'm formally calling for 2 votes. First, rejecting the predatory loan from Titan Capital that would guarantee this company's destruction. Second, a vote of no confidence in Margaret Parker as CEO. The room exploded in chaos. Board members talked over each other. Executives looked shocked and Margaret stood frozen, her face drained of colour. David Chen called for order. Ms. Parker, you're within your rights to call these votes. We'll proceed. First, the vote on the Titan Capital loan. All in favour of approving. Margaret's hand shot up along with 3 board loyalists. 4 votes. All opposed. I raised my hand. Martin raised his as proxy. And then Andrew slowly raised his hand too. 2 board members who'd been silent raised their hands as well. 67% against 33% for. The loan was dead. The loan is rejected, David Chen announced. Now for the vote of no confidence in Margaret Parker as CEO. All in favour of removing Mrs. Parker. The same hands rose. 67%. All opposed. Margaret's hand trembled as she raised it with her 3 loyalists. 33%. Not enough. The vote carries, David Chen said. Margaret Parker is removed as CEO effective immediately. Per bylaws, the board must appoint an interim CEO. Are there nominations? 1 board member stood. I nominate Jessica Parker as interim chairman of the board with authority to appoint an acting CEO until permanent leadership is established. The vote was quick and unanimous among those who'd sided with me. Within minutes, I was formally installed as chairman, and Margaret Parker no longer controlled the company her husband had built. 2 security guards appeared at the door. Margaret gathered her belongings with shaking hands, her face a mask of shock and rage. As she walked toward the exit, every eye followed her. At the doorway, she turned back. Our eyes met across the conference room, and she mouthed 4 words with absolute venom. This isn't over. Then she was gone, and I stood at the head of the table where she'd sat for 15 years, the forgotten daughter who'd become the one who saved them all. The 3 days after Margaret's removal were a controlled hurricane of damage control and strategic decisions. As interim chairman, I spent 18-hour days meeting with the department heads, reviewing financial records Margaret had kept hidden, and reassuring nervous employees that Parker Home Supplies wasn't about to collapse despite the dramatic leadership change. The company was in worse shape than even I'd anticipated. Cash reserves, dangerously low vendor relationships, strained major clients questioning the instability. Every meeting revealed another problem Margaret had been ignoring or covering up another fire that needed immediate attention. Andrew proved surprisingly helpful during those first days, working long hours beside me to document everything, reach out to concerned stakeholders, and begin the difficult process of rebuilding trust. He'd made his choice in that boardroom voting against Margaret, and now he was living with the consequences. She'd called him twice since being removed, and both times he'd let it go to voicemail. He played them for me, her voice cold and accusatory, calling him a traitor, a coward, disowning him completely. I watched him delete both messages without responding. On Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after the vote, I was in my new office, Margaret's old office, though I'd already had maintenance remove all her personal items and redecorate reviewing vendor contracts when my assistant Rebecca knocked hesitantly on the door. "Jessica, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent." "I don't have time for walk-ins today, Rebecca. Tell them to schedule through proper channels." Rebecca's expression was strange, almost pitying. "It's Margaret Parker." I looked up sharply. "What? Your mother? She's in the lobby." Jessica, she looks terrible. I think you should see her." I considered refusing out of principle. Margaret had made me leave this building with security escort 10 years ago. She'd systematically destroyed my business a year ago. She'd tried to burn down my father's company rather than let me save it. Every instinct screamed to have security throw her out the same way she'd thrown me out, but curiosity won. "Send her in." I stood and moved to the window, my back to the door, arms crossed defensively. I heard the door open, heard footsteps that seemed slower and more hesitant than I remembered, heard the door close again. I waited a full 10 seconds before turning around. The woman, standing in my office, looked nothing like the Margaret Parker who'd sat at the head of that boardroom table, radiating controlled fury. This Margaret looked 10 years older than she had just 3 days ago. Her hair, always perfectly styled, was streaked with grey I'd never noticed before, and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a plain sweater instead of her usual tailored suits. Her hand shook as she clutched a manila folder against her chest. And her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, the eyes of someone who'd been crying for days. "Jessica," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "Thank you for seeing me." I didn't move from the window, didn't offer her a seat, didn't make this easy. "You have 5 minutes. What do you want?" Margaret flinched at my tone but didn't argue. She set the folder on my desk with trembling hands. "There are documents that need both our signatures. Legacy contracts your father negotiated years ago, bank accounts tied to the Parker family name, vendor agreements that specify continuity of leadership. Without transition, signatures from both the outgoing CEO and incoming chairman, they all default. Penalties, breaches potential lawsuits." I moved to the desk and flipped open the folder. The documents were legitimate. I could see that immediately. Contracts with major suppliers, banking relationships, partnership agreements, all with clauses requiring proper leadership transition protocols. Margaret was right. Without both signatures, Parker Home Supplies would face a cascade of defaults that could push the company into bankruptcy within weeks. "So, you need something from me?" I said flatly. "How familiar?" "I'm not here to manipulate you," Margaret said quietly. "I'm here because these defaults would destroy the company. They'd destroy everything your father built. His reputation, his legacy, the Parker name, all of it, would be dragged through bankruptcy courts and lawsuits. I know you hate me, Jessica, I've earned that. But do you hate your father's memory enough to let it be destroyed?" The question hit harder than I expected. I looked at her standing there, this woman who'd erased me, who'd killed my father with stress and betrayal, who tried to burn down his company rather than admit she was wrong. Every fibre of my being wanted to refuse to watch her beg to make her feel the powerlessness she'd inflicted on me for so many years. But then I thought about my father's grave, about the letter he'd left me, asking me to fight for justice, not revenge, about the trust he'd created to protect me, the wisdom he'd tried to teach me, about leading with integrity rather than cruelty. "Is this about saving the company?" I asked quietly, my anger giving way to something more complicated. "Or is this about him, about Dad?" Margaret's composure, already fragile, shattered completely, her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as her legs seemed to give out. She collapsed into the chair in front of my desk, her whole body shaking with sobs that sounded like they had been building for years. "I've destroyed everything he built," she gasped between sobs. "Everything he loved. The company, the family, our marriage, you, everything. Robert gave me the world and I repaid him by stealing from him, lying to him, killing him with stress and betrayal. And then I came after you, the daughter he adored, because I was jealous. Because he loved you more than me, and I couldn't stand it." I stood frozen, watching my mother break down in a way I'd never witnessed. This wasn't strategic tears or manipulative emotion. This was genuine, devastating grief, and guilt pouring out of someone who'd been holding it inside for too long. I let him die, carrying my secrets. Margaret continued, her voice raw. I watched the stress destroy him, and I did nothing to stop it because I was more afraid of being exposed than I was of losing him. What kind of person does that? What kind of monster chooses her own protection over her husband's life? She looked up at me with eyes full of self-hatred and despair. And then you came back, strong, successful, everything I pretended to be but never was. And instead of being proud, instead of being grateful that Robert's legacy lived on in you, I tried to destroy you too, just like I destroyed him. Margaret buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving. I've destroyed everything he built, everything he loved, including you. I moved to my desk and sat down slowly, putting physical distance between us, while my mind processed what I was witnessing. Margaret's breakdown seemed genuine, but I'd learned not to trust anything she presented. Still, something about this felt different. This wasn't the controlled, manipulative woman who'd orchestrated my removal. This was someone who'd been carrying unbearable weight and had finally collapsed under it. Why? I asked quietly. Why did you hate me so much that you had to erase me I was your daughter? What did I ever do to deserve what you did to me? Margaret wiped her eyes with shaking hands. You didn't do anything. That's what made it worse. You were perfect. Smart, capable, ethical, everything a daughter should be. And your father saw it. Every day I watched him light up when you walked into a room. I watched him praise your ideas, trust your judgment, rely on you more than he relied on me. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I started forging documents 15 years ago, long before you worked here. Small things, at first redirecting funds to accounts I controlled, giving myself more authority than your father intended. I got away with it because Robert trusted me completely. He never questioned my decisions. That trust made it easy to betray him. The admission hung in the air and I felt my hands clenching into fists. This was the confession my father had died trying to expose. But then, you joined the company. Margaret continued, her voice gaining a bitter edge. Suddenly, there was someone who did check things, who asked questions, who noticed when numbers didn't add up. You were too good at your job, Jessica, too thorough. I knew it was only a matter of time before you found what Martin had found, what your father eventually found. So I made you invisible. I dismissed your work, gave credit to Andrew, kept you away from anything that might expose me. You made me invisible because I was a threat to your crimes, I said. I was terrified of my own daughter, Margaret corrected, because you were smarter than me, more capable than me, more ethical than me, because your father loved you more than he loved me, and I couldn't stand it. I was jealous of my own child. Despite everything, I felt a twist of something that might have been pity. But then I remembered my father's letter, and the pity hardened back into anger. Dad found out, I said. He discovered what you'd been doing. That's what killed him. Margaret's face crumpled again. He came to me with evidence, bank records, forged signatures, everything. He was devastated. He kept asking, why, Margaret? Why would you do this to us? And I panicked. Instead of confessing, I told him he was losing his mind. I said the stress was making him paranoid and delusional. I gaslit my own husband when he confronted me with proof. Her voice broke completely. He said he was going to lawyers, that he couldn't let it continue. And I threatened him. I told him if he tried to expose me, I'd have him declared mentally incompetent. I'd make sure his children never knew the truth, that his legacy would be destroyed by scandal. I watched him walk away from that conversation looking destroyed, and 3 days later, he was dead. You killed him, I said, my voice flat and cold. Not with your hands, but with your cruelty and pride. Yes, Margaret whispered. I killed him, I watched the stress destroy his heart over 3 days, and I did nothing. Part of me thought if he died before meeting with those lawyers, my secret would be safe. What kind of monster thinks that way? She looked at me with desperate, horrible truth. And then, after he was gone, I couldn't stop. I kept embezzling, kept lying, kept destroying everything Robert built. And when you came back strong and successful, I tried to destroy you too. Because that's what I do, Jessica. I destroy everything good in my life because I'm too broken to let anyone be better than me. The confession was complete, every crime laid bare. Margaret sat in that chair broken and sobbing, and I tried to process the full scope of what she'd just admitted. Then I heard movement from the door connecting my office to the adjacent conference room. The door I'd left slightly ajar because Andrew had been working there all morning. Andrew stepped through that doorway, his face pale and streaked with tears. Margaret's head snapped toward him, and I watched the colour drain from her face. "Andrew," she breathed, "how long have you been—" "I heard everything," Andrew said, his voice shaking but clear. "Every word, Mum, every confession, every crime, every reason you destroyed Dad and Jessica." He walked further into the room, standing beside my desk. "I came in through the other door to drop off files. I was going to leave, but then I heard you start talking and I needed to hear it. I needed to know the truth from your own mouth." Margaret stood unsteadily, reaching toward him. "Andrew, please, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," he cut her off. "You killed Dad to cover up your crimes. You erased Jessica because she threatened to expose you. You destroyed our family because you're a criminal and a coward. And I just heard you confess to all of it." Margaret's face transformed from desperate to calculating, and I saw the old Margaret resurface. "You can't prove anything. It's just my word." "Against 2 witnesses," I interrupted coldly. "Andrew and I both heard your confession. We can both testify to every word you just said." I stood and walked around the desk. "I'll sign your documents. I'll help you prevent those defaults and protect Dad's reputation. But you're going to do exactly what I say. You're going to publicly resign from all positions. You're going to enter therapy. You're going to repay every cent you embezzled. And you're going to live with the knowledge that Andrew and I can destroy you completely anytime we choose." Margaret looked between us, seeing the united front of the children she'd betrayed, and something inside her finally, truly broke. She nodded slowly, all fight gone. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. I walked back to my desk and pulled out a legal pad, my hand steady as I began writing. Margaret and Andrew watched in silence as I listed each term, each condition, each requirement. When I finished, I tore the page off and slid it across the desk toward Margaret. "These are non-negotiable," I said. "You do all of this exactly as specified, or Andrew and I go public with everything you just confessed. Your choice." Margaret picked up the paper with trembling hands and read through my terms. I watched her face as she processed each one, saw her flinch at certain points, saw resignation settle over her features. "You want me to publicly apologize," she said quietly, "in front of the entire company." "You publicly humiliated me," I replied. "You had security escort me out while my colleagues watched. Turnabout is fair play. And 50% of my dividends." Her voice held a note of disbelief. "That's hundreds of thousands of dollars annually." "That's less than what you embezzled from the company Dad built," I said coldly. "Consider it restitution. The Robert Parker Memorial Fund will support employees' families, college scholarships for their children, emergency financial assistance, retirement support, all the things you should have been investing in instead of lining your own pockets." Margaret looked at the list again. 2 years of mandatory therapy, weekly sessions. "You need professional help, and you're going to get it," I said. "Andrew and I will verify attendance. Misses a single session without a documented medical emergency, and the deal is off." She set the paper down and looked at me with eyes that held no fight left, just exhausted acceptance. When do you want the public apology? Friday, all hands company meeting, every employee, every department. You're going to stand in front of everyone who watched you erase me 10 years ago, and you're going to tell them the truth. 2 days later, Parker Home Supply's main auditorium was packed with over 200 employees. I'd worked with HR to ensure maximum attendance, framing it as a critical company update that everyone needed to hear. Rumours had been flying since Margaret's removal speculation about financial trouble, leadership changes, possible layoffs. The room buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in and found seats. I stood at the side of the stage with Andrew, both of us watching as the auditorium filled. Many faces I recognised from a decade ago, older now, some greyer, but familiar. Sarah from accounting, who'd always smiled at me in the hallway. David from operations, who'd implemented my supply chain recommendations. Janet from HR, who'd had to process my termination paperwork with tears in her eyes. They saw me standing there and confusion crossed their faces, trying to place me, wondering what the former director they'd watched get fired was doing on stage at a company meeting. Margaret arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, escorted by her attorney who'd insisted on being present. She looked small, somehow diminished, wearing a simple black suit that seemed to hang on her frame. She carried a single piece of paper, the statement Andrew and I had reviewed and approved, every word carefully chosen to be truthful, without being unnecessarily cruel. I walked to the podium first. Thank you all for coming. I know there's been a lot of uncertainty lately about Parker Home Supply's leadership and direction. Today, we're here to address that directly. I'm Jessica Parker, and I've recently been appointed interim chairman of the board. But before we discuss the company's future, there's something that needs to be said about its past. Margaret Parker has a statement to read. I stepped aside and Margaret approached the podium with the careful steps of someone walking to their own execution. She gripped the podium edges, her knuckles white, and looked out at 200 faces, watching her with curiosity and confusion. My name is Margaret Parker, she began, her voice barely audible until she adjusted the microphone. I served as CEO of this company for 15 years, and I'm here today to tell you that I wrongfully removed my daughter Jessica Parker from this company 10 years ago. The auditorium went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Jessica worked here as director of operations. She was brilliant at her job, more capable than I ever was. She saved this company millions through her operational improvements and strategic thinking. And I pushed her out because I was jealous, because I was afraid, because my late husband Robert Parker saw Jessica's value more clearly than he saw mine, and I couldn't bear it. I watched Margaret's hand shake as she read. Several employees were leaning forward in their seats, others looking at me with dawning recognition and shock. I had security escort Jessica from this building after stripping away her position and equity. I erased her from our company history because she threatened to expose my incompetence and corruption. And for 10 years, I've let everyone believe she wasn't good enough to be here, when the truth is I wasn't good enough to lead alongside her. Margaret's voice cracked, but she pushed forward. Jessica Parker is the rightful leader of Parker Home Supplies. She has her father's integrity, his strategic mind, his commitment to doing what's right, even when it's difficult. I am stepping down permanently and completely from all company positions effective immediately. This company belongs in her hands, not mine. She folded the paper with shaking hands and walked off the stage without looking at anyone. The auditorium remained silent for several long seconds, 200 people processing what they'd just heard. Then, from the middle section, Sarah from accounting stood up. She was crying, her hands coming together in slow, deliberate claps. David from operations stood next, then Janet from HR, then others. I recognised and many I didn't. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applause building from scattered clapping into a thunderous ovation that echoed off the walls. I stood at the side of the stage, tears streaming down my face as 200 people I'd worked alongside, people who'd watched me get erased, people who'd witnessed my humiliation, stood and applauded the vindication that had taken 10 years to achieve. The sound washed over me like a wave, and I felt something break open in my chest. Not pain this time, but release. The girl who'd left this building in shame didn't exist anymore. In her place stood someone who'd survived betrayal, built an empire, and reclaimed everything that had been stolen. Through my tears, I saw my father's portrait hanging on the back wall, the official founder's photo that had been there since the building opened. His eyes seemed to find mine across the crowded room, and I whispered words only he could hear. "I did it, Dad. I chose justice over revenge." The standing ovation eventually ended, but the real work was just beginning. In the days that followed Margaret's public apology, I moved from emotional vindication into the practical reality of rebuilding a company that had been systematically mismanaged for over a decade. My first act as chairman was to order a complete financial audit, not the sanitized versions Margaret had been presenting to the board, but a forensic accounting examination that would uncover every hidden account, every questionable transaction, every dollar that had been redirected from its intended purpose. The audit took 30 days and cost the company $40,000 in accounting fees. When the final report landed on my desk, I sat alone in my office and read through all 217 pages. The conclusion was devastating. In its precision, Margaret had embezzled exactly $2.3 million over 15 years through a complex web of shell companies' falsified expense reports and redirected vendor payments. The accountants had traced every dollar, documented every forged signature, built an ironclad case that could have sent Margaret to prison for decades. I called Margaret that evening and told her to come to my office the next morning. She arrived looking like she'd aged another 10 years, her attorney beside her, both of them, clearly expecting criminal charges. I slid the audit report across my desk and watched her face as she read the executive summary. $2.3 million, I said quietly. That's what you stole from the company my father built. That's what your jealousy and greed cost. Margaret's attorney started to speak, but she held up her hand to stop him. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not pressing criminal charges," I said, and I saw the shock register on both their faces. "But you're going to pay back every cent over the next 10 years through a structured payment plan. The money will go into an employee benefit fund, the same fund your dividend payments are already supporting. You'll work with our accounting team to liquidate whatever assets are necessary to meet the payment schedule." "Why?" Margaret's attorney asked, clearly suspicious of mercy. "Why not prosecute? You have overwhelming evidence." "Because prosecuting her destroys the Parker name completely," I replied, looking at Margaret. "It makes Dad's legacy about scandal and crime instead of the good company he built. I won't do that to his memory. But make no mistake, this is not forgiveness. This is pragmatic justice. You pay back what you stole, you continue your therapy, and you live the rest of your life knowing your children will never trust you again." The next phase of reconstruction focused on the people Margaret had damaged during her tenure. I had HR pull personnel files for everyone who'd been fired, demoted, or passed over for promotion during the past 15 years. Then, I personally reviewed each case, identifying patterns of retaliation, favoritism, and discrimination. 23 people stood out as clear examples of Margaret's vindictive management employees who'd questioned her decisions, who'd been too competent and therefore threatening, who'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. I spent 6 weeks reaching out to each person individually. Some were still in the industry, some had left entirely. I met them in coffee shops and restaurants, always in person, never hiding behind email or phone calls. I told them the truth about what had happened, apologised on behalf of the company, and offered them positions back with full back pay for the years they'd lost. Not all of them accepted. Some had built new lives and didn't want to return to a place that held painful memories. But 23 did come back, and they formed the core of my new leadership team. These were people who understood what it meant to be unfairly dismissed, who valued integrity because they'd been punished for having it. The transformation happened faster than I dared hope. Within 3 months, with ethical leadership and the operational excellence I'd always known the company was capable of, Parker Home Supplies stabilized. Within 6 months, we were growing. The stock price, which had plummeted during Margaret's final year, rebounded 40%. Major clients who'd left during the chaos returned reassured by the leadership change and the transparency I insisted on in all our operations. Industry publications took notice. Business Weekly ran a feature titled Jessica Parker, the woman who saved her family's legacy without destroying her family. Forbes published an interview where I talked about choosing accountability over revenge, about building companies on ethics rather than fear. CM Business did a segment on family-owned companies and used Parker Home Supplies as an example of successful generational transition despite adversity. Through it all, Andrew worked quietly beside me. True to his word, after that boardroom vote, he'd accepted a position as junior manager in operations, a significant demotion from his former VP title, but one he took without complaint. He reported directly to me, worked 12-hour days, and slowly, painstakingly began learning what it actually meant to run a business rather than just occupy a title. 6 months into the reconstruction, I was working late in my office, reviewing quarterly projections, when Andrew knocked on my door. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and I'd assumed everyone else had gone home. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, lingering in the doorway. "Come in," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. He sat down, and I noticed he looked exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes from honest work rather than stress avoidance. He'd lost weight, his suits fit better, and there was something different in his eyes. Something that looked like earned humility. "I've been thinking a lot about the past 6 months," he said carefully. "About everything you've done to rebuild this company, to save Mum from herself, to give me a chance I absolutely didn't deserve." He paused, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I spent 35 years being incompetent and getting away with it because Mum covered for me. I took credit for your work stood by while she destroyed you and then helped her try to destroy your business. I've been a coward and a fraud my entire professional life." "I know," I said simply because there was no point in arguing with the truth. "I don't deserve your trust yet." Andrew continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe I never will, but I want to earn it, and I want to actually be good at this, to contribute something real, instead of just occupying space and collecting a paycheck." He looked up at me, and I saw genuine desperation in his eyes. "Will you teach me not as your brother, not as Mum's son, but as someone who wants to actually learn how to do this right? Will you show me what Dad tried to teach me, and I was too arrogant to learn?" I studied him for a long moment. This man who'd been my biggest obstacle for so many years, who'd betrayed me and then finally chosen the right side. He'd voted against Margaret when it mattered. He'd witnessed her confession and stood beside me. He'd accepted a massive demotion without complaint and worked hard for 6 months without asking for recognition. Maybe redemption was actually possible. "Yes, I said finally. "But this won't be easy, Andrew. I won't go easy on you because you're family. I'll hold you to the same standards I hold everyone else higher, actually, because you have more to prove." "I know," he said, and for the first time in our lives, I saw genuine gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Jessica, for everything. For saving the company, for giving me another chance, for being better than both Mum and I deserved." Andrew left my office that night, and I sat in the quiet, thinking about redemption and second chances and how strange it was to be in a position to grant them. A year ago, I'd been fighting to save my own business from Margaret's sabotage. Now I was chairman of Parker Home Supplies, rebuilding my father's legacy, teaching my brother how to actually earn his place. The next morning, my assistant had scheduled a one-on-one with Sarah Chen, a 25-year-old financial analyst who'd been with the company 8 months. She'd requested the meeting for career development advice, standard enough that I'd approved it without much thought. Sarah arrived at 2 o'clock, precisely carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a conservative suit that reminded me uncomfortably of myself at that age. But what struck me most was her face. She'd clearly been crying recently, her eyes slightly red despite her professional demeanour. "Sarah, come in," I said, gesturing to the chair. "Have a seat. What can I help you with?" She sat carefully arranging her portfolio with nervous precision. "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Parker. I know you're incredibly busy." "Please call me Jessica," I said, softening my tone. Something about her reminded me strongly of my younger self. "What's on your mind?" Sarah took a shaky breath. "I'm struggling with a family situation, and I don't know who else to talk to." The story came out in fits and starts. She was the first person in her family to graduate college, the first to pursue a professional career. She'd worked incredibly hard, earned this position through merit, and was good at her job. But her family, traditional conservative, was pressuring her relentlessly to quit. "They say work isn't appropriate for women in our family," Sarah said, tears finally spilling over. "They want me to focus on finding a husband, getting married, having children. My mother calls daily, asking when I'm going to stop this career phase and settle down. My father says I'm bringing shame by prioritizing work over marriage. And my grandmother told me no man will want me if I'm too educated and too independent." I felt something twist in my chest, a recognition so sharp it was almost painful. This wasn't exactly my story, but the core was the same. A young woman, talented and capable, being told she didn't deserve her place, being pressured to make herself smaller. "How old are you, Sarah?" I asked quietly. 25. "I was 32 when my mother removed me from this company," I said, watching her eyes widen. "Not because I wasn't good at my job. I was excellent, but because she felt threatened by my competence. She erased me from Parker Home Supplies, stripped my equity, and had security escort me out while my colleagues watched." Sarah leaned forward, tears momentarily forgotten. "I heard rumours about what happened at the all-hands meeting, that you used to work here and your mother pushed you out. Is that true?" Every word I confirmed. And for 5 years afterward, I rebuilt myself from nothing. I founded a consulting firm, earned a reputation based solely on my abilities, and proved that my worth had nothing to do with the Parker name or my family's approval. I paused, choosing words carefully. "Sarah, I spent 32 years trying to be the daughter my mother wanted me to be, working 60-hour weeks, sacrificing everything to earn approval that was never going to come, and it almost destroyed me." "But you survived," Sarah said, her voice filled with desperate hope. "You came back and won." "I survived because I finally understood something crucial," I said, leaning forward. "Your family's approval is a gift when it's given freely, but it's not a requirement for your worth. You don't need your parents to validate your career choices. You don't need your grandmother to approve of your independence. You need to build a life you're proud of, a life that reflects your values and abilities. And if your family can't see that worth, that's their loss, not yours." Sarah's tears were flowing freely now, but they were different, not shame or fear, but relief. "Everyone else tells me I should compromise, find a balance, but I don't think that's possible. They want me to give up everything I've worked for." "Then you have a choice to make," I said gently but firmly. "You can sacrifice your dreams to make them comfortable, or you can choose yourself. Choose your abilities, your potential, your right to build the life you want. It won't be easy. They might reject you. But Sarah, I promise you this, 10 years from now, you won't regret choosing yourself. You'll only regret the years you spent trying to be someone you're not." Sarah pulled out a tissue and wiped her eyes, and when she looked at me again, there was something different in her expression. something stronger. "I thought I was the only one," she whispered. "I thought I was crazy for wanting both a career and my family's love. I thought there was something wrong with me." "There's nothing wrong with you," I said firmly. "There's nothing wrong with wanting to use your talents, with being ambitious, with refusing to make yourself smaller. And you're not alone, Sarah. There are thousands of women facing the exact same pressure. You're just brave enough to ask for help." She stood slowly gathering her portfolio but seemed taller, somehow more solid. "Thank you," she said, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for showing me it's possible to survive rejection and still succeed. I needed to hear that from someone who actually lived through it." After Sarah left, I sat alone as afternoon light slanted through the windows. Her words echoed, "Thank you for showing me it's possible." It struck me that everything I'd survived Margaret's betrayal, the years of rebuilding the public battle, wasn't just about me. My pain had purpose beyond my own vindication. My story could light the path for others walking through similar darkness. I picked up my phone and texted Martin. "I want to start a mentorship program for women pushed out of family businesses. Will you help me design it?" His response came within seconds. "Already started drafting the proposal. I was wondering when you'd realise your story was bigger than just yours." The mentorship program became my passion project over the following months, but as I threw myself into designing curriculum and recruiting mentors, I noticed something troubling. I'd won. I'd reclaimed my father's company, forced Margaret to account for her crimes, rebuilt Parker Home Supplies into something ethical and successful. I should have felt satisfied at peace. Instead, I woke at 3 a.m. with my jaw clenched. I snapped at employees over minor mistakes. I replayed conversations with Margaret in my head, thinking of sharper ways I could have hurt her. 6 months after Margaret's public apology, Andrew pulled me aside after a board meeting. "You're not sleeping. You look exhausted. When's the last time you took a day off?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. You're not fine," he replied with genuine concern. "Jessica, you saved the company. You won, but you're still acting like you're fighting a war that's already over. Maybe you should talk to someone, a professional." I wanted to dismiss him, but the truth was, I'd been thinking the same thing. Margaret was required to attend weekly therapy as part of our agreement, but it had never occurred to me that I might need the same help. I was the victor, not the victim. I was strong, successful, in control. Except I couldn't handle this. I'd achieved everything I'd set out to achieve and still felt like something inside me was bleeding. I made an appointment with Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a therapist who specialised in family trauma. Her office was decorated in soothing blues and greys with soft lighting that felt nothing like harsh corporate spaces. "Tell me what brought you here," Dr. Morrison said after we'd settled in. "I don't know if I should be here," I admitted. "I'm not the victim anymore. I won. I got justice. I saved my father's company and forced my mother to account for what she did." "But," Dr. Morrison prompted gently. "But I'm still so angry," I said, and hearing myself say it out loud made something crack inside my chest. I gave her mercy when I could have destroyed her. I made her apologise publicly. I saved her from prison. So why am I still so angry? Why do I wake up at night replaying everything, imagining all the ways I should have hurt her more? Does that make me a hypocrite? Dr. Morrison leaned forward. "Jessica, do you know the difference between forgiveness and healing?" I shook my head, feeling suddenly close to tears. "Forgiveness isn't a feeling," she explained. "It's a decision to stop letting someone's actions poison your life. It's choosing not to seek revenge, not to let bitterness consume you. And by that definition, you've already forgiven your mother. You chose justice over destruction. That's forgiveness." "Then why am I still so angry?" "Because forgiveness and healing are two different things," Dr. Morrison said gently. "The anger you're feeling isn't about revenge anymore. It's grief. Grief for the mother-daughter relationship you never had and never will have. Grief for your father who died carrying terrible knowledge. Grief for the 10 years you lost the trust that was shattered. You can forgive someone and still grieve what they took from you. Those feelings can exist simultaneously, and you're allowed to feel both. Something inside me broke open, then a dam I'd been holding through sheer force of will. Tears started falling, and once they started, I couldn't stop them. I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself since that day in the cemetery, reading my father's letter. But these tears were different. They weren't rage or humiliation or vindication. They were grief, pure and simple, for everything I'd lost and could never get back. I cried for the little girl who tried so hard to make her mother proud. I cried for the 32-year-old woman escorted out by security. I cried for my father, who died knowing his wife had betrayed him. I cried for 10 years spent rebuilding from rubble, years I could have spent doing anything else. And I cried for the relationship I'd never have with my mother. Not the fantasy relationship I'd spent 32 years chasing, but any relationship at all. Because whatever fragile détente we'd reached her, making restitution, attending therapy, acknowledging her crimes, it wasn't love, it wasn't family, it was just two people coexisting in the aftermath of mutual destruction. Dr. Morrison sat quietly through my tears, offering tissues, but not trying to stop the flow. When I finally exhausted myself, she spoke again. "What you're feeling is normal, Jessica. You've been running on adrenaline and determination for years. Now that the crisis is over, your body and mind are finally processing everything. That's not weakness. That's healing." I nodded, feeling strangely lighter despite the rawness. I thought winning would fix me. I thought once I had justice, once Margaret paid, I'd feel whole again. But I don't. I just feel tired. Winning was important, Dr. Morrison said. Justice matters, but it doesn't erase trauma. It doesn't undo years of pain or magically restore what was stolen. Healing requires different work processing grief, learning to live with scars, building a new understanding of yourself that isn't defined by what was done to you. We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the time the session ended, I felt raw but somehow cleaner, like I'd lanced an infected wound. Dr. Morrison scheduled me for weekly sessions, and I agreed without hesitation. I left her office and walked toward the elevator, my eyes still red and puffy, but my shoulders lighter. As I rounded the corner to the waiting area, I stopped short. Margaret sat in one of the waiting room chairs, her own appointment clearly scheduled after mine. She looked up when I appeared and our eyes met. I saw her take in my tear-stained face, saw recognition and something that might have been guilt flicker across her features. For the first time since this journey began, I didn't feel anger when I looked at her. I felt pity. Pity for a woman so broken by jealousy and insecurity that she'd destroyed everything she should have treasured. Pity for someone whose own daughter could only look at her with sadness instead of love. I nodded once, acknowledging her presence without speaking, and walked to the elevator. As the doors closed, I saw her still watching me, and I wondered if she felt pity for me too, or if she was still too consumed by her own wounds to see anyone else's pain. That moment in the therapist's waiting room became a turning point I didn't recognise until much later. Margaret and I continued our separate therapy journeys, our paths intersecting only through necessary business matters and the monthly reports Andrew provided about her restitution payments. We were cordial when we had to interact, professional when circumstances required it, but there was no warmth, no connection beyond the bare minimum required by our intertwined circumstances. Then, about 3 weeks after that encounter, I received a letter at my office. Not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten note on plain stationery, delivered by regular mail. Margaret's handwriting, which I recognised from countless company documents over the years, filled a single page with careful, deliberate words. "Jessica, I'm writing because my therapist suggested I start acknowledging specific ways I hurt you, not to seek forgiveness, but to take accountability. This week, I've been thinking about your college graduation. You were valedictorian of your business school class, and I didn't attend the ceremony because I told myself I was too busy with a client meeting. The truth is I was jealous. I couldn't bear to watch you receive recognition I'd never earned. I'm sorry. I read the note 3 times looking for manipulation or hidden agenda, but found only stark, uncomfortable honesty. I filed it away and didn't respond. The next week, another letter arrived. Then another. Week after week, for 18 months, Margaret sent me handwritten notes, each one acknowledging a specific failure, a particular cruelty, a moment when she'd chosen her insecurity over her daughter's well-being. I see now that I destroyed my family because I was terrified of being ordinary. I made you pay for my insecurity. I gave Andrew credit for your supply chain proposal because watching you succeed made me feel inadequate. I told your father you were too emotional for leadership positions because I was afraid you'd be better at running the company than I was. Some weeks I read them immediately. Some weeks they sat unopened on my desk for days. But I kept every single one, filing them chronologically in a drawer in my home office, a growing record of Margaret's reckoning with herself. After about a year of letters, Margaret did something unexpected. She asked through Andrew if I would meet her for coffee. Not at the office, not for business, just as two people trying to understand each other. I almost said no. The comfortable distance we'd maintained felt safer than whatever vulnerability a personal meeting might require. But my therapist encouraged me to consider it, and Andrew quietly vouched that Margaret was genuinely different, now softer in ways that seemed real rather than strategic. We met at a small coffee shop neither of us had been to before, neutral territory that belonged to neither of our histories. Margaret arrived first, and I saw her through the window. Before I entered, sitting alone at a corner table, looking older and smaller. Then I remembered her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like she needed its warmth. "Thank you for coming," she said when I sat down, and there was none of the imperious tone I'd grown up with. Just quiet gratitude. "I almost didn't," I replied honestly. "I've gotten comfortable with the distance between us." "I know." Margaret looked down at her coffee. "I've gotten comfortable with it too in some ways. It's easier than facing what I destroyed. But my therapist keeps asking me what I want my relationship with my children to look like in 5 years, in 10 years. And I realised I don't want to die having never had a real conversation with my daughter. We talked for 2 hours that afternoon, and it was the first genuine conversation we'd ever had. Not mother issuing instructions to daughter, not CEO dismissing employee, but two women with decades of shared history trying to understand how they'd arrived at this painful place. "I was jealous because your father saw in you what I wished I could be," Margaret admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "Genuinely kind, naturally talented, and secure enough not to need constant validation. I spent our entire marriage trying to prove I was indispensable to the company, desperately seeking recognition for every achievement. And you just were. You were competent without being arrogant. You were confident without being cruel. You were everything I'd tried so hard to become and failed. I spent 32 years trying to earn your approval," I said quietly. "Trying to be perfect enough that you'd finally see me. It never occurred to me that you were incapable of seeing me because you were too busy comparing yourself to me." "I know that now," Margaret said. "Too late, but I know it. Dr. Morrison has helped me understand that I projected all my self-hatred onto you. Every time I saw you succeed, it reminded me of my own inadequacies. So I made you smaller, invisible, hoping that would make me feel larger. It never did. It just made me more hollow." I studied her across the table, this woman who'd given birth to me but had never really been my mother. "I don't know if I can ever love you the way a daughter should love a mother," I said, and I saw her flinch but continue meeting my eyes. "That relationship died a long time ago, and I don't think we can resurrect it. But I can respect the work you're doing to change. I can acknowledge that you're facing your failures honestly, instead of running from them. That's where we'll start." "That's more than I deserve," Margaret whispered. "Probably," I agreed. "But Dad taught me that justice should include the possibility of redemption. I'm trying to honour that." We sat in silence for a moment, And then Margaret asked the question I could see had been building throughout our conversation. "Do you think your father would have forgiven me?" Her voice broke on the words. "For the embezzlement, for the lies, for causing the stress that killed him." I thought about my father's letter, about the trust he'd created to protect me, about the man who'd valued fairness and kindness above all else. I thought about how he'd spent his final days not seeking revenge, but trying to ensure his daughter would be protected from Margaret's destruction. And I gave Margaret the only honest answer I could. "I think Dad would have been devastated by what you did," I said carefully. "I think he would have been heartbroken that the woman he loved chose embezzlement and lies over honesty. But I also think," I paused, choosing my words with care, "I think he would have wanted you to face the consequences of your actions and genuinely change. Not to escape punishment, but to become someone worthy of the forgiveness you're seeking. So the real question isn't whether he would have forgiven you. The question is whether you're becoming someone who deserves that forgiveness." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded slowly. "I'm trying. Every day I'm trying." "I know," I said, and for the first time in my life I realised I believed her. That coffee shop conversation marked the beginning of something I couldn't quite call reconciliation, but was more than mere coexistence. Margaret and I met occasionally over the following months, always in public places, always with clear boundaries. We talked about her therapy progress, about the restitution payments she was steadily making, about small, safe topics that didn't venture too deep into the wounds we were both still healing. It wasn't mother and daughter. It probably never would be. But it was two people learning to exist in the same world without causing each other pain, and that felt like progress. Meanwhile, Parker Home Supplies continued to thrive under ethical leadership. In year 14, I made a decision that felt both practical and symbolic. JP. Consulting the company I'd built from nothing to prove I could succeed without the Parker name was going to merge with Parker Home Supplies, but not as an acquisition or absorption, as a true merger, creating something new that honoured both legacies. The announcement came at a board meeting in March. "I'm proposing we restructure as Parker and Park Enterprises," I said, displaying the new logo on the screen. Parker for my father's legacy, the company he built with integrity and vision. Park for the company I built independently, proof that the values he taught me could thrive anywhere. Together, they represent something better than either could be alone. The board approved unanimously. Squad. By summer, the merger was complete, and Parker and Park Enterprises stood as a testament to both the business my father had founded and the one I'd built from the ashes of being erased from it. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. I'd taken my father's maiden name to escape my family's shadow, and now I was bringing it home, transformed into something stronger. That same summer, the Second Daughters Initiative officially launched. Martin and I had spent over a year designing the program, with input from therapists, business consultants, and lawyers. We offered free mentorship to women who'd been pushed out of family businesses, paired them with successful entrepreneurs who understood their struggles, provided legal support for those facing discrimination or unfair treatment, and even established a small business loan fund to help them start their own ventures. The response overwhelmed us. Within 2 weeks of announcing the program, over 200 women applied. We accepted 50 for the first cohort, and reading their applications broke my heart. So many stories like mine, daughters deemed not good enough. Sisters overlooked for incompetent brothers, wives pushed out by controlling husbands, all of them carrying wounds that went far deeper than professional setbacks. At the inaugural gathering, I stood before 50 women ranging in age from 23 to 67, representing dozens of industries, united by the common experience of being erased from businesses they'd helped build. "I know what it feels like to be invisible," I told them. "To work yourself to exhaustion and watch someone else take credit. To be told you don't deserve the legacy your family built. But I also know what it feels like to rebuild yourself from nothing, to prove your worth to yourself rather than seeking it from others, and to reclaim what was stolen not through revenge, but through excellence. That's what we're here to help you do. Besides, several women were crying before I finished. Afterward, they lined up to thank me, to share their stories, to tell me they'd felt alone until they found this community. One woman, a 58-year-old who'd been pushed out of her family's restaurant chain, hugged me tightly and whispered, "You gave us permission to choose ourselves. Thank you." In the fall, I made another announcement that felt like completing a circle. Andrew had been working as a junior manager for 3 years, putting in genuine effort, learning from his mistakes and slowly earning the respect of people who'd watched him coast on his family name for decades. He'd proven himself capable when he actually tried, when he stopped expecting success to be handed to him and started earning it through competence and hard work. At the quarterly board meeting, I recommended his promotion to Vice President of Operations. The board approved based on his performance record, not his last name. When I announced it at the company all-hands meeting, Andrew stood to speak and I saw genuine emotion on his face. 3 years ago, my sister gave me something I didn't deserve, a second chance. He said, his voice steady but thick with feeling. After I'd stood by while our mother destroyed her, after I'd helped sabotage her business, after I'd been complicit in every injustice done to her, Jessica still gave me the opportunity to prove I could be better. I've spent 3 years trying to earn that trust, and I'll spend the rest of my career proving she was right to believe in me. The applause that followed was genuine, not the polite golf claps people offer out of obligation. Andrew had earned this moment, and everyone in that room knew it. That evening, we held a celebration dinner for the leadership team at an upscale restaurant downtown. 50 people who'd worked incredibly hard to transform Parker Home Supplies from a failing, corrupt company into something ethical and successful. Midway through the meal, Sarah Chen, the young analyst I'd mentored over a year ago, now a rising star in our finance department, raised her glass. "I have a question for Jessica," she said, and the room quieted. "You've accomplished something extraordinary. You rebuilt a company, launched a mentorship program, transformed your family. But it came at enormous cost. 10 years of pain fighting your own mother, losing so much time. Was it worth it?" The room waited for my answer, and I felt the weight of the question. I thought about the girl who'd been escorted out of this company by security, broken and invisible. I thought about the years spent rebuilding myself, the battles fought, the grief processed, the healing that was still ongoing. I thought about my father's grave and the promise I'd made to choose justice over revenge. I smiled and the answer came easily. "Yes, I said, "but not for the reasons you think. It wasn't worth it because I won, or because I reclaimed the company, or even because I forced accountability. It was worth it because I learned that my value doesn't come from family approval, or professional titles, or revenge accomplished. It comes from knowing I can survive betrayal and still choose integrity. From knowing I can have power and still choose mercy. From knowing that the hardest battles aren't against our enemies, but against becoming like them. That's what made it worth it." The celebration continued long into the evening, but I left early claiming exhaustion, though the truth was, I needed solitude. The next morning was October 12th, 15 years to the day since my father died. 15 years since Margaret's betrayal had literally broken his heart. I drove to Riverside Cemetery just after dawn, when the light was soft and golden. The oak tree had grown larger, its branches spreading wider. My father's grave sat in its familiar spot, the granite weathered, but the words still clear. Robert Parker, devoted husband, loving father, visionary entrepreneur. I knelt and placed a bound copy of Parker & Park Enterprises' latest annual report against the headstone. The cover featured our logo and a headline from Business Ethics magazine, "Most ethically rated company in home supplies industry for 3rd consecutive year." "I brought you something, Dad," I said quietly, my fingers tracing his name. "Proof that everything you taught me actually worked. That integrity isn't idealistic nonsense, it's good business. That fairness isn't weakness, it's the foundation of trust. That kindness isn't passive, it's the hardest form of strength. The morning breeze rustled through the oak leaves, and I imagined it was him listening. I spent so many years thinking your legacy was the company, I continued. The building, the clients, the market share. But that wasn't your legacy at all, was it? Your legacy was teaching me that how we build matters more than what we build. That choosing justice over revenge isn't losing, it's winning, in the only way that matters. I looked at the annual report. Parker and Park Enterprises is profitable and ethical. We treat employees with respect. We maintain transparent relationships. Margaret is making restitution and genuinely trying to change. Andrew has become the brother I needed, and I'm helping other women survive what you couldn't protect me from. My voice broke slightly. You taught me fairness matters more than winning, that kindness is strength, and that integrity is non-negotiable. I finally understand I was carrying your real legacy all along, not in balance sheets, but in how I choose to lead, how I choose to forgive, how I choose to lift others. That's what you gave me, Dad, and I'm passing it forward every single day. I stood slowly and placed my hand on the headstone. I hope you're proud. I hope you know your daughter chose to be like you instead of becoming like the people who hurt us. I turned to walk back to my car and my phone rang. Unknown number. Something made me answer. Hello. Ms. Parker. A young woman's voice trembling. I hope this isn't presumptuous. I got your number from the Second Daughters Initiative website. My name is Emily Parker, no relation, and I need help. I stopped walking. What kind of help, Emily? I just got pushed out of my family business. Her voice cracked. My father's construction company. I've worked there since I was 16, learned everything, put myself through engineering school at night. Yesterday, my dad told me he's leaving everything to my younger brother, who's never shown up on time. He said I should focus on starting a family instead of playing at being a businessman. Everyone says I should just accept it, that fighting will only make things worse. I closed my eyes and suddenly I was 32 again, sitting in that dark apartment with Margaret's words echoing, "You don't deserve to be part of this family." But then I read an article about you, Emily continued, about how you were erased from your family company and spent years rebuilding yourself, about how you came back and started helping other women. I thought, maybe I don't have to just accept this. So I'm calling, and I know you're probably too busy, but can you help me? I looked back at my father's grave at the morning sun illuminating his headstone and felt something click into place. This was why I'd survived. This was why the pain had purpose. Not to win, but to become the person who could answer this call, who could tell Emily what no one had been there to tell me. Yes, Emily, I said, my voice steady. I can help you. Let me tell you a story about a forgotten daughter who became the one who saved them all. And then we'll figure out how to write your own story, one where you don't disappear, you don't give up, and you don't let anyone convince you that you're not enough. I heard her exhale with profound relief. Thank you, she whispered. Meet me at my office tomorrow morning, I said. 9 o'clock. Bring documentation of your work contracts. You negotiated projects, you managed anything demonstrating your value. And, Emily, bring a notebook. We have a lot of work to do. When I ended the call, I stood in the cemetery parking lot, feeling the weight of 15 years settle into something that finally made sense. All the pain, all the struggle, they'd forged me into someone who could answer that call, someone who could be for Emily what I desperately needed and didn't have. I looked back at my father's grave one last time. The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows through the oak branches, and for just a moment in that particular quality of light, I could swear I saw him standing there beside his headstone. Not a ghost, but the memory of him so vivid, it felt like presence. And he was smiling, that proud, gentle smile he'd given me when I'd done something that honoured his values. I smiled back, raised my hand in a small wave, and drove toward my office. Emily would be the first of many. The second daughter's initiative was just beginning, and somewhere out there, other forgotten daughters were fighting battles I understood too well. My father's real legacy wasn't the company he'd built. It was the daughter he'd raised to build something better. And that legacy would continue one forgotten daughter at a time for as long as I had breath to fight and voice to say, "You are enough. You always were. Now let me show you how to prove it." Thank you for listening to my story. 15 years ago, I was erased from my family's company, told I didn't deserve to be part of my own family. Today, I run Parker & Park Enterprises, mentor women facing similar struggles, and help rewrite endings for forgotten daughters everywhere. This journey taught me that justice isn't about destroying your enemies, it's about refusing to become like them. That forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing peace over poison. And that the hardest battles we fight aren't against the people who hurt us, but against letting their cruelty change who we are. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, overlooked despite your efforts, or pushed aside for someone less capable, I want you to know you're not alone. Your worth isn't defined by who validates you. It's defined by who you choose to become when no one is watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you experienced family favoritism or workplace discrimination? How did you handle it? What would you have done in my position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters, and sharing it might help someone else who's walking through similar darkness right now. And if you found value in this story, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week, we share stories of resilience, redemption, and the courage it takes to choose integrity over revenge. These aren't just stories, they're roadmaps for anyone navigating family betrayal, corporate injustice, or the difficult path of rebuilding after loss. Remember, being forgotten doesn't mean you're forgettable. Being erased that doesn't mean you were never valuable. Sometimes the people who push us out are simply too broken to recognize what they're losing. Thank you for listening. Until next time, choose justice, choose integrity, and most importantly, choose yourself.